A World War II soldier could survive the bullets in the morning, then nearly collapse at night because the only food left was a dirty potato dug from a frozen field. The supply truck behind him never came, the field kitchen had gone cold, and the road that should have brought bread was broken by mud, shellfire, and fear. A cold tin of meat, a bowl of watery soup, a dry canteen, or a piece of bread traded for cigarettes could decide whether he marched, fought, slept, or broke before morning. This is not a story about grand battles, but about the small meals that kept men human when the army behind them began to fail. Tonight we follow those soldiers into the mud, the ruined kitchens, the jungle rain, and the empty roads where survival began with one question: what is left to eat? So, before you settle in, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if these slow war history stories are the kind of thing you truly enjoy. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from, and what time it is where you are. It always feels strange and wonderful to know that people in different places are hearing the same story in the dark. Now, lower the lights. Let the room grow still. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background sound, and let's follow this forgotten road of hunger, fear, and survival together tonight. If a soldier in World War II waited for supper, the first warning was often not a shell landing near his trench. It was a cold field kitchen, a half-empty crate, and a cook who looked at the road behind the line more than at the men in front of him. A man could sit on an ammunition box, hold an open tin between his knees, and scrape the bottom with a spoon while artillery broke the route where the trucks were meant to come. The meal did not vanish at once. It became smaller. One man received a thinner slice of bread, another found only a spoonful of meat left in the tin, and the coffee was stretched until it tasted more like warm water than anything useful. Nobody wanted to ask too many questions, because questions made the problem real. Everyone noticed anyway. Food at the front depended on more than cooks and appetite. It depended on roads, railways, bridges, ports, fuel dumps, warehouses, drivers, clerks, field kitchens, and weather that could turn a track into mud before noon. A unit might look close to safety on a map, but between that unit and its next meal, there could be broken rails, bombed bridges, blocked roads, burned fuel, enemy aircraft, or shellfire falling on the only passable route. Dinner was a chain, and one broken link could empty 1,000 bowls. That was the first hard lesson. A soldier did not eat because his side was brave, or because the plan looked strong, or because officers spoke confidently over a map. He ate because a truck arrived, because the driver survived the road. After all, petrol reached the depot, and because nobody destroyed the bridge before the convoy crossed it. War became simple at the bottom of a tin. It is almost impressive how fast military pride can shrink into a grown man, wondering whether licking the lid would make him look desperate. Around him, the others tried to act normal, but their hands gave them away. One folded a crust of bread into cloth and pushed it deep inside his tunic. Another counted cigarettes, not because he wanted to smoke, but because cigarettes could become food if the next truck failed to arrive. The hunger was not yet starvation. It was only the start, which made it more believable and more dangerous. It was a smaller serving, a skipped ladle of stew, a biscuit saved for morning, and a man drinking too much water before sleep so his stomach would stop complaining for a while. The body understood before the mind admitted it. Fear entered quietly. It came with a portion size. Many supply crises in World War II came from ordinary causes made brutal by war. Armies moved too fast for their trucks. Units were surrounded, ports were damaged, railway yards were bombed, fuel ran short, roads disappeared into mud, and air control changed from one day to the next. Men at the front did not need to know every reason. They only had to feel the result when the ration box came open and looked too light when they stood up. Legs became slower, the cold seemed to bite harder, and the pack on the shoulders felt heavier by afternoon than it had in the morning. Hunger made tempers shorter, orders harder to follow, and small mistakes more likely. A tired man could still obey, but a tired and hungry man obeyed with less strength behind his eyes. A person today might complain when a food delivery is late, but these men could miss one convoy and begin measuring how long discipline would last before hunger started making choices for them. That thought changed a small behavior. Men stopped eating everything at once. They checked pockets more often. They watched anyone who still had bread, and they looked toward the rear road as if staring could pull engines out of the smoke. The field kitchen mattered because it proved the unit was still connected to the world behind it. A hot meal meant someone knew where these men were, counted them, planned for them, and expected them to keep fighting. When the stove went cold, the silence around it felt larger than hunger. It suggested that the army had not vanished, but the thread tying the front to the rear had begun to fray. Officers could say the delay was temporary. They could say the trucks would come after dark, after engineers cleared the road, or after the shelling eased. The men listened because there was nothing better to do. But hunger made every promise sound thinner. By evening, the open tins lay beside boots, scraped bright at the bottom. A few crumbs sat on a folded paper, and someone picked them up with a wet finger without making a joke of it. The road behind the trees stayed empty. Nobody laughed much now. I find this first stage of battlefield hunger unsettling, because nothing has broken yet, but every man already knows tomorrow may ask more from a weaker body. No one has collapsed, no one is fighting over food, and no one has been forced to eat anything terrible. They are still soldiers, armed, still under orders, yet every thought keeps circling back to the same question. Will the trucks come? That question could follow a man into the dark. He might lie with his coat pulled tight, stomach clenched but not yet screaming, listening for engines beyond the shell bursts. Every distant rumble could become hope for a moment, and every silence after it could settle into disappointment. The body learned quickly. The first failed delivery did more than reduce supper. It changed how men looked at food, at the road, and at one another. A crust became property. A cigarette became currency. Water became a trick against the stomach, and a hidden biscuit became both caution and shame. The front line had gained another enemy, one that did not need to fire. This was not chaos yet, it was arithmetic. The first broken meal showed that a supply collapse did not begin with madness, but with a smaller spoonful, a thinner drink, and men quietly hiding what little they had left. From that cold kitchen, the story moves into the food that could survive longest inside a pack. The dry rations carried when the real meal failed. And when those hard biscuits and cold tins came out, the men would discover that something could keep them alive while still leaving their bodies feeling cheated after every bite. The dry ration usually came out when the field kitchen could no longer reach the men, and no one treated it like a real meal at first. A soldier might open a cold tin of meat with the point of a bayonet, pass a few hard biscuits from one dirty hand to another, and pour tea so weak that it barely changed the colour of the water. The food was there, and that mattered, but the body could tell the difference between being saved and being fed. It was survival, not supper. These rations existed because armies had to move food across broken places. A loaf of fresh bread could go stale, soup needed a kitchen, Stew needed fuel, and cooked meals needed men, pots, time, and roads that were not under fire. Dry food lasted longer, packed tighter, and could be carried in a bag, a truck, a crate, or a pocket without needing much care. That made it valuable. A ration could contain meat in a tin, hard biscuits, chocolate, sugar, tea, coffee, cigarettes, canned goods, or some emergency food used only when nothing else arrived. Different armies used different systems, and the exact contents changed by country, front, year, and supply situation. To a hungry man near the line, those differences mattered less than the same basic fact. He opened what he had. It is a strange kind of mercy when the thing keeping you alive also makes you feel cheated after every bite. The meat could be cold and greasy, with fat clinging to the edge of the tin. The biscuit could be so hard that a man had to soak it, break it with a knife handle, or chew until his jaw hurt. The coffee might wake him slightly, but it did not fill the hollow space under his ribs. At first, could be grateful. After a reduced meal, a ration in the pack meant the day had not fully turned against them. A soldier could eat in a shell hole, behind a wall, in a ditch, inside a ruined farmhouse, or while sitting on his helmet because the ground was too wet. He did not need a stove, a table, or a cook. He only needed fingers strong enough to open the tin. That mattered at the front. When men were marching, hiding, digging, or waiting under fire, food that required no real preparation could make the difference between staying upright and sliding into useless exhaustion. A biscuit in the pocket could be eaten during a pause. A square of chocolate could be shared quickly before another move. A tin of meat could be passed along without anyone needing to light a fire. But the body wanted more than calories. It wanted warmth, softness, water, salt in the right amount, and the feeling that food had been prepared for a human being rather than packed for an emergency. Dry rations could stop hunger from becoming collapse, but they rarely repaired what cold, fear, fever, mud, and lost sleep had taken away. A man could eat and still feel empty. That was the cruel part. He had eaten. After several days, the same taste became harder to bear. Metal, old grease, salt, stale biscuit, weak tea, and tobacco smoke could blend into one tired flavour that seemed to coat the mouth. Men who would once have eaten anything without complaint began staring at the tin before putting the first bite in. It was not pickiness. It was the body growing sick of the same emergency repeated as routine. A modern person might call a meal boring after eating the same canned food for 2 days. But these men could chew the same cold ration under shell fire and still be expected to march, dig, aim, and stay calm. The biscuit scratched the mouth. The meat made them thirsty. The chocolate, when they had it, disappeared too quickly to feel like comfort. Even cigarettes, often included or traded, became part of the hunger economy rather than a simple pleasure. The problem was not only taste. Dry food often needed water to become bearable, and water was not always as easy to find. A hard biscuit without enough liquid could sit in the mouth like plaster. Salty meat could make thirst worse. Tea or coffee could help for a moment. But if the water was low, even making a drink became a decision. Men began to stretch what they had. One biscuit might be saved for morning, half a tin wrapped and hidden, sugar kept in a paper twist, cigarettes counted again before sleep. The ratio turned into a private calculation. Eat now and feel stronger for the next hour, or save it and face the dark with the stomach still pulling at itself. There was also shame in eating too openly. A man who still had food could feel eyes on him, especially when others had already finished theirs. He might turn his body slightly away, eat slowly, or offer a piece he could barely afford to lose. Hunger changed manners without asking permission. It made kindness expensive. I find these dry meals sad because they show how low the standard of comfort can fall before anyone admits that something has gone wrong. A man could sit with food in his hand and still remember soup, potatoes, bread, cut thick, or coffee strong enough to smell before it reached the lips. He could remember a kitchen at home where food was ordinary and therefore invisible. At the front, even a bad, hot meal could become a memory sharp enough to hurt. The officers knew dry rations were useful, but useful did not mean enough. A unit could survive on them for a time, yet survival was not the same as readiness. Men grew tired, constipated or sick, thirsty, irritable, and less able to recover between movements. The army could count the ration as issued, but the body kept its own record. That record showed in small ways. Men sat longer before standing. They stopped joking about the food, they scraped tins more carefully and checked corners of ration boxes for crumbs. When the last biscuit snapped in half, both pieces were watched. Dry rations kept order alive because they gave men something official to hold on to. They proved the army had not fully lost contact with them. They delayed panic, filled pockets, and allowed movement when kitchens failed. Yet they also reminded every soldier that the normal system had broken, and that every meal now came from a reserve meant for worse days. Those worse days were close. The dry ration kept the soldier moving, but it could not give back the warmth, rest, and strength that a real meal would have restored. When the tins ran low and the hard biscuits were gone, hunger pushed the men away from army supplies and toward whatever food the war had left behind in civilian homes, and the next meal might come from a stranger's kitchen beside a child's unwashed bowl, where survival began to feel like crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. First kitchen was the kitchen door hanging slightly open. It moved a little in the wind, not enough to make a sound, only enough to show that someone had left in a hurry, or had been forced to leave before the house could be closed properly. Inside, the room still looked like a place where people had lived only yesterday, with a few potatoes on a shelf, a small jar of fat near the stove, a little flour in a sack, and a child's bowl left unwashed on the table. The soldiers stood there longer than they needed to. They were hungry enough to understand the value of every item in the room. A potato was not just a potato now, but a few more hours of warmth in the body, a little more strength in the legs, and perhaps one less man shaking from an empty stomach before morning. The jar of fat could turn water and scraps into something closer to food. The flour could become paste, dough, or a thin soup if someone had time to heat it. This was how the war entered civilian homes. When supply lines broke, soldiers did not always find food in official crates or army depots. They looked in abandoned houses, barns, cellars, gardens, fields, village stores, and farm sheds that had been left behind as people fled shelling or advancing troops. What had once belonged to a family became part of a battlefield calculation. It is a bitter little joke that an army could march under flags and orders, then end up treating a stranger's pantry like an emergency supply box. The men might tell themselves the house was empty and that no one was there to use the food. They might say the owners had gone far away or that the potatoes would rot if left behind. Hunger gave them reasons quickly. But the room argued back without speaking. There was the child's bowl, still cloudy with dried porridge at the bottom. There was a wooden chair pushed back from the table, a coat peg on the wall, a small cloth folded beside the stove, and footprints in dust near the door. These were not supplies in a warehouse. They were pieces of a life. A soldier could reach for the potatoes and still feel his hand slow down. He might have taken food from ration crates without thought, but taking from a kitchen was different. The body wanted food, while the mind noticed the signs of the people who had needed it before him. That was the line. In many parts of World War II, civilians fled quickly and left food behind because staying was more dangerous than losing what they owned. Some left flour, grain, preserved meat, vegetables, livestock or jars stored for winter. Soldiers from different armies might buy, trade, requisition, seize or steal, depending on the place, the command, the discipline of the unit and how desperate they had become. The result often looked the same to the people who returned. Their food was gone. For the soldiers, one small meal could matter. They could boil potatoes in a dented pot, smear a little fat onto hard bread, mix flour with water, or divide a few onions among men who had been eating cold rations for days. The taste might feel almost luxurious after metal tins and hard biscuits. For a moment, the house could give them what the army had failed to deliver. A person today might feel guilty taking the last slice from a shared plate, but these men sometimes had to take the last food from a house whose owners might be hiding hungry in another village. That thought did not always stop them. Hunger rarely made people noble. It made them practical first, ashamed later. The shame came in small moments. A man might see a child's cup and think of his own younger brother. Another might find a family photograph tucked behind a tin and put it back quickly, as if touching it made the theft clearer. Someone might joke too loudly while filling a bag, trying to cover the discomfort in the room. Nobody needed to answer. The difference between requisition and stealing could become thin at the front. A paper order, an officer's instruction, or a claim of military need could make the act official. But the kitchen still looked the same after the men left. The shelf was emptier. The flour sack was lighter. The family, if they returned, would have fewer ways to survive the next week. That is why these meals carried a second hunger inside them. The soldiers ate because they needed to keep moving, yet the food did not feel clean in their minds. A potato taken from a field might feel like a find, but a potato taken beside a child's bowl felt like a confession. The body accepted it faster than the conscience did. I find this kind of hunger harder to watch than the cold ration, because it turns need into something that can injure people who are not even in the room. The soldiers were not always cruel men. Many were young, exhausted, frightened, and far from home. But war does not wait for every person to feel innocent before it demands another choice. By the time the squad left the house, the room looked only slightly changed. A few potatoes were gone, the jar of fat had been scraped lower, and the flour sack had been tied again with less inside it. The men stepped back into the road with full pockets and quieter faces. Behind them, the kitchen stayed open. The meal might help them survive the day. It might give one man enough strength to carry ammunition, another enough warmth to stand guard, and another enough steadiness to keep walking when the unit moved again. But it also left behind the knowledge that survival had reached into someone else's home. That knowledge did not digest easily. The abandoned house showed that hunger could push soldiers past a line before they had time to name it. When shelves, cellars and kitchens gave out, the food search moved outside into fields where the earth itself became the next ration box. There, a man might kneel in frozen mud, dig up a dirty potato with his bayonet, and eat something that could keep him alive while making him sick before morning. A soldier digging in a frozen field did not look like the picture most people imagine when they think of an army. He still had a rifle across his shoulder, a helmet low over his eyes, and mud dried on his sleeves. but his hands were busy with a bayonet pushed into the soil. He worked around a small potato, loosened it from the cold ground, wiped it once against his coat, and blew on it as if breath could make it clean. Then he put it in his pocket. This was what happened when the kitchen failed. The ration tins were gone, and the abandoned houses had already been searched. The men stopped looking for food as something prepared for them, and started looking for anything the ground had not taken back. A field became a cupboard, a ditch became a shelf, and a broken garden could mean one more meal. Hunger lowered the eyes. Potatoes, turnips, sugar beets, cabbage, grain, fallen fruit, garden vegetables, or anything left after harvest could become valuable once the supply line broke. Soldiers used whatever local food they could find when they were cut off, retreating, advancing too fast, or waiting where official supply had failed. The food was not always good, clean, or safe. It was simply there. There is something quietly humiliating about a uniformed man searching a field like a beggar after harvest. But hunger does not care about the dignity of uniforms. But he might use a bayonet, a knife, a mess tin, or bare fingers stiff from cold. He might find a potato so small it barely filled his palm, a turnip split by frost, or a handful of grain mixed with dirt. He would still keep it. Food from the ground carried dangers. A root could be frozen hard, half rotten, mouldy, fouled by mud, or buried near places shelled for days. Grain could be damp and sour, and vegetables could be covered with dirt that no one had enough clean water to wash away. The field might also be mined. That was the worst part. The same earth that held food might hold explosives. A man bending down for a potato could be in a field that farmers once crossed every morning, but now every step had to be tested with fear. Hunger pushed him forward, while training told him not to trust the ground. If the men could cook what they found, the food became easier to face. A few potatoes boiled in a tin, a turnip sliced into weak soup, a handful of grain softened in water, or cabbage thrown into a shared pot could feel better than another cold biscuit. But fire was not always possible, water was not always clean, and time was rarely generous. Many meals were rushed. Sometimes the food was eaten half raw. A soldier could bite into a hard root, chew slowly, and feel grit scrape between his teeth. He might swallow pieces too large because it felt worse than forcing them down. Pain often came later. In a warm kitchen, bruised vegetable disappear into the bin without a second thought. Yet these men could carry a dirty frozen beet in a pocket as if it were something worth guarding. Hunger changed. Value, a cracked cabbage leaf, a handful of grain, or a muddy potato became a private treasure because the march would not wait for a proper meal. What would have been animal feed or rubbish in ordinary life became something men watched with careful eyes. War made scraps important. The consequences were plain. Raw or badly cooked food could bring cramps, diarrhea, nausea and weakness at the exact moment a man needed strength. Too much dirt, too little water, and unfamiliar plants could make the body rebel. Yet the alternative was an empty stomach before guard duty, a march, or another night in wet clothing. There was also a mental cost in this kind of eating. A soldier who had once stood in line for issued rations now crouched in a field with his fingers in the dirt, trying to decide whether a route was worth the trouble. The army still gave him orders, but the ground gave him supper. That inversion was hard to forget. No one needed to explain that they had fallen lower. The men could feel it in the silence while they searched, in the way no one made jokes about the first potato, and in how quickly hands moved when someone found something edible. Hunger made the group practical, almost animal in attention. Every small discovery pulled eyes toward it. What lingers is the simple fact that a man could know the food might make him sick and still put it in his mouth because tomorrow required a body that could stand. He was not choosing comfort. He was choosing motion. A bad meal was still better than weakness so deep that the legs failed under a pack. By dusk, the field looked almost unchanged. A few holes marked where hands had searched, frost had been broken, and the men had moved on with roots in pockets and grain wrapped in cloth. Smoke from distant shelling sat low beyond the hedges. The earth had fed them poorly. The frozen field showed how far hunger could pull soldiers down, from issued rations to roots dug out with a bayonet and eaten with dirt still on the skin. Beyond the fields, some units found themselves in places where the ground offered no potatoes, no cabbage, and no grain worth gathering. In the forest and snow, a hungry man could stare at leaves, bark, berries, and dirty meltwater without knowing which one might keep him alive and which one might ruin his body by morning. In a winter forest, a soldier had to look at the ground differently. He could no longer think of food as something packed in tins, stacked in crates, or handed out from a field kitchen. He pushed aside stiff leaves with a shaking hand, searched under low branches, checked the base of trees, and looked for dry berries, seeds, roots, or anything small enough to chew, without knowing whether it would help him or punish him. The forest seemed full, but it gave no promises. This was a different kind of hunger from the hunger in a field. In a field, a man might at least understand what he was searching for, such as potatoes, turnips, grain, or vegetables left from a farm. In the woods, everything looked possible and suspicious at the same time. A berry could be food, poison, or nothing useful at all. Soldiers ended up in places like this for simple reasons. A unit could be cut off, a patrol could lose its way, a retreat could scatter men into trees and ravines, or a winter march could leave someone behind when his feet slowed too much. Once separated from trucks, kitchens, depots, and ration boxes, the soldier had only what remained in his pockets and what his eyes could recognize. If he recognized nothing, the world became almost empty. The cruel thing about a forest is that it can surround a starving man with life, and still offer him no meal he can trust. There might be bark, moss, roots, old nuts, mushrooms, frozen berries, and dirty snow within reach. But hunger does not make a person an expert. A tired soldier could stare at a plant for a long time and still not know whether it would feed him, sicken him, or waste the little strength he had left. Different fronts made this problem worse in different ways. In the forests of Eastern Europe, snow could hide roots and make water difficult unless a man had heat to melt it safely. In the mountains of Italy, cold stone and distance could make every search slow and painful. On Pacific islands or in the jungles of Southeast Asia, food might rot quickly. Insects could cover supplies, and unfamiliar plants could punish the careless. The environment had its own rules. A man from a city might know nothing useful about wild food. A farm boy might do better with roots, grains, or animal tracks. But even he could be helpless in strange terrain. Local civilians knew the land because they had lived with it season after season. A soldier thrown into it by war had to learn while hungry, cold, frightened, and watched by enemies. That was not a fair lesson. He might try to eat what looked safest: a dry berry, a few seeds, a strip of something scraped from a root. He might chew slowly, waiting for bitterness, burning, or the first warning from his stomach. Sometimes the taste alone was enough to make him spit it out, but sometimes fear of wasting food forced him to swallow anyway. Back in ordinary life, plain food could be rejected without a thought. Yet in that forest, one shriveled berry could sit between two dirty fingers like the answer to the whole night. the change was not only physical. Hunger narrowed his thinking until every object became a possible source of energy. A fallen branch was fuel, snow was water if he could melt it, and a dry root was a question pressed against his mouth. The danger was not only poison, dirty water could weaken him faster than waiting. Strange plants could bring cramps, vomiting, or diarrhea, and that could be worse than hunger when the body was already cold and short of strength. Even safe food might give too little energy to matter. He could spend more effort finding it than he gained from eating it. A soldier in the snow faced another problem. Snow looked clean, but eating it directly could chill the body and make thirst return. Melting it took fire, and fire could reveal him. Without a pot, without fuel, and without time, even water became a trap between need and danger. Survival became a list of bad options. There were moments when the forest seemed to mock him. Birds could move above him, animal tracks could cross the snow, and dry leaves could cover tiny things he could not identify. He might hear distant engines or gunfire and know his own army was somewhere beyond the trees, but not close enough to feed him. The war was near, and supplies were far. The most painful part is the uncertainty, because the soldier is not only asking whether he can eat, he is asking whether he can trust his own judgment while his body is getting weaker. A wrong decision might not kill him immediately. It might only make him dizzy, sick, slower, and easier to leave behind. That was enough. By evening, his pockets might hold almost nothing. A few dry berries wrapped in cloth, a root too hard to chew properly, a handful of seeds, or snow packed into a tin with no safe way to melt it. His stomach would still feel empty, but now his mouth might carry bitterness and grit. The forest had given him work, not relief. He would keep moving because stopping meant cold would settle deeper. He would look at the ground again because hunger made hope stubborn. He would lift another branch, check another hollow, and stare at another dark berry with the same question as before. Is this food, or is this another way to become weaker? The answer did not always come in time. The forest and snow showed that hunger could become a test of knowledge, not just endurance. Because the wrong berry, root, or mouthful of dirty water could ruin a man faster than an empty stomach. In another kind of collapse, soldiers did not search under leaves or ice because the food stood beside them on hooves and pulled their guns through mud. When horses and mules began to fall on the road, the men had to face the moment when an animal that had carried the army might be cut apart and boiled for the last meal of the unit. The dead horse lay beside the road with its harness still twisted around its body. Mud covered its legs, one wheel of the gun carriage had sunk near its flank, and the men standing around it kept their rifles low, as if they were looking at something private. For a few moments, no one moved toward it with a knife. Everyone understood what it could become. World War II is often remembered through tanks, trucks, aircraft, and machines, but many armies still depended heavily on animals. Horses, mules, and other draft animals pulled guns, wagons, medical carts, ammunition, field kitchens, and supplies through places where engines failed or roads did not exist. In Eastern Europe, in mountains, in mud, and in areas where fuel was short, an animal could keep a unit moving when a truck could not. The old war had not disappeared. That made the moment worse. The animal had not been only meat in waiting. It had carried shells, dragged wheels through mud, helped move wounded men, and pulled loads that soldiers could not carry on their backs. It had been part of the unit's strength. Now the men looked at it with hunger in their faces. There is a cold practicality in war that can turn even gratitude into a knife held above something that helped you survive yesterday. A hungry unit could not afford to think too long about sentiment. If rations were gone, fields were empty, and villages had already been searched, meat on the road meant calories. It meant men might stand another guard shift, pull another cart, or march one more mile before weakness caught them. The decision was not simple. Meat from a fallen animal could help, but it brought problems immediately. The men needed knives sharp enough to cut, containers to carry pieces, fire to cook it, water to boil it, salt to preserve it, and time to do all this without being seen. In a clean kitchen, meat was food. On a shelled road, it was a task surrounded by danger. The animal might have been killed by exhaustion, shell fragments, disease, or a fall in the mud. The men did not always know. They had to judge quickly whether the meat could be used, whether it had been lying too long, whether the weather had kept it cold enough, and whether cooking would make it safe enough to risk. Hunger pushed the answer toward yes. That was not comfort. It was a calculation. In some places, soldiers had eaten horse before the war and did not see the meat itself as strange. In other units, especially for men attached to the animals that worked beside them, the act felt heavier. A horse had eyes the men recognized, habits they had cursed, and a place in the daily routine of movement and labor. Cutting it apart could feel like losing a piece of the unit twice. In ordinary life, people can choose meat by price, taste, or habit. But on that road, the choice could shrink to this animal, this knife, this hour, and no better option behind them. The men might work without talking much. One held the leg steady, another cut strips, another searched for wood, while someone else watched the sky and the tree line. The first concern was not flavour. It was whether the work could be finished before shells, patrols, aircraft, or darkness made it impossible. Cooking brought its own risk. Raw meat could make men sick, but smoke could betray them. A fire had to be small, hidden and quick. If they had no pot, they might try to roast pieces badly over weak, flames blackening the outside while the inside stayed tough and questionable. If they had water, it became a thin broth that smelled stronger than it tasted. The smell could be dangerous too. Hungry men noticed it. So did other soldiers. A unit cooking meat after days without food could draw attention from stragglers, civilians, or enemies, close enough to smell smoke and fat in the air. Food was never private for long when everyone around was hungry. The meal itself was not like a relief in a story. It could be tough, greasy, undercooked, oversmoked, or nearly tasteless without salt. Men chewed because chewing meant strength might return later. Some ate quickly, some turned away first, and some stared at the road while swallowing. Nobody needed to say what the animal had been that morning. The hardest part is not that hungry soldiers ate horse meat, but that they could know exactly what the animal had done for them and still need its body more than its memory. That is what the supply collapse did. It not only takes away comfort, it changed the meaning of things until a companion in labour became a ration, a harness became a reminder, and a roadside death became an opportunity no one wanted to waste. Afterward, what remained beside the road looked worse than before. The harness might still lie there, the cart still stuck, the mud still marked by hooves that would not move again. The men carried pieces wrapped in cloth, tucked into tins, or placed in bags that once held dry rations. Their stomachs might be less empty, but the road behind them had changed. A meal like that could keep men alive for another day. It could give strength back to hands that had begun to shake, warmth to bodies that had gone too long on cold scraps, and a little steadiness to a unit that had been weakening hour by hour. But it also showed how far the collapse had reached. The army was now eating part of the system that had carried it. There was no victory in that, only continuation. By night, the meat might be boiled in a hidden pot, roasted over a guarded flame, or saved raw because the men did not dare light a fire yet. The same soldier who had once waited for trucks were now watching smoke, counting minutes, and hoping the smell did not travel. They had found food, but food had brought another problem. How could they cook it without being found? The fallen horse showed how hunger could turn the army's own means of movement into one last source of food. Once the men had meat in their hands, the next danger was no longer only starvation, but the fire needed to make that meat safe enough to eat. A single ribbon of smoke above a hidden cook fire could call down artillery, aircraft, or a patrol before the first mouthful reached the bowl. A small fire near the front line was never just a small fire. A soldier might place a tin of water on 2 broken bricks, feed a few scraps of wood beneath it, and pull his coat around the flame to keep the light from spreading. Another man sat close with his rifle across his knees, not watching the water, but watching the sky, the road, and the dark line of trees. The tin warmed slowly. The men wanted heat because cold food had begun to wear them down. A warm drink could soften a hard biscuit, loosen a dry throat, and make the stomach believe a real meal was coming. A thin soup made from scraps, roots, or a little meat could make the body feel less abandoned for an hour. Heat mattered, but heat also gave them away. Smoke could rise above a hedge, firelight could flash through a crack in a wall, and the smell of cooking could travel farther than the men wanted to believe. In a place watched by artillery observers, patrols, aircraft, or enemy scouts, even boiling water could become dangerous. Cooking was no longer just cooking. There was something cruelly practical about needing to hide a fire as carefully as a weapon. The men were not trying to make a proper meal. They were not trying to make anything warm without inviting shells onto their own heads. One wrong curl of smoke could turn a pot of soup into a marker for the enemy. The stomach asked for warmth, while fear told the hands to smother the flame. Soldiers used whatever fuel they could find. Broken furniture, dry grass, paper, crate wood, cloth, bits of packaging, or small stove fuel could all become precious if they burned low and fast. A fire might be dug into a hole, hidden behind a wall, covered from above, or shielded with coats and bodies. The meal had to stay small. That made everything tense. The water barely steamed before someone whispered for the flame to be lowered. The meat stayed tough because no one wanted to cook it long enough to draw attention. Roots softened only halfway, coffee came out weak, and soup remained thin because there was not enough heat to make it better. Every minute had a cost. Still, they tried. A hot mouthful gave more than calories. It gave warmth to stiff fingers, a short rest from chewing cold fat, and a reminder that the body was still worth caring for. For a few moments, the men could gather around the tin like it was the smallest kitchen left in the war. As that little tin of water slowly warms, you can take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe if these slow war history stories help you settle in. It helps carry small forgotten moments like this a little farther to another listener somewhere in the dark. In an ordinary kitchen, steam above a pot means comfort is close. But on that road, it could mean someone with binoculars had just found you. That was the difference war made. A smell that once called people to a table could call artillery to a ditch. A glow that once meant supper could become a warning light. The men learned to cook like thieves. One watched the flame, one watched the sky, and one listened for engines or footsteps. They kept their bodies low, broke fuel into tiny pieces, and lifted the cover only when they had to. The food belonged to everyone, but so did the danger. Sometimes the meal was hardly worth the fear. A piece of meat could be black outside and raw in the centre. A biscuit could soften only enough to become paste. A drink could taste of smoke, metal, and old water, but warm was still warm. The danger did not disappear after the first sip. Smoke could hang in damp air, especially in woods, ruined villages, valleys, or cold, low ground where wind moved badly. A flame could jump when fresh fuel was added. Someone could lift a coat too high, and for one careless second, the light could show helmets, faces, rifles, and the cooking tin. That was enough. The sad truth is that the men were not being reckless. They were simply tired of eating, as if their bodies no longer deserved warmth. Hunger had already reduced the size of their meals. Cold food had taken the comfort from eating. Now fear was trying to take away the fire too. If shells landed nearby, the meal ended at once. The tin tipped, water spilled into dirt, and the flame disappeared under boots. Men dropped flat with food still in their mouths and hands still reaching for rifles. No one argued with the ground. On quieter nights, the fire lasted long enough to help. Each man received a mouthful of weak soup, a softened biscuit, a strip of meat, or a drink that was warmer than the air around him. They passed the tin carefully because spilling it would feel like wasting something larger than food. For a short while, the group became less brittle, yet even that comfort did not feel clean. Every sip had been guarded, every smell had been feared, every bit of heat had been taken under the possibility that someone else might see it. The meal warmed the body, but it kept the nerves awake. By the end, the men covered the ashes with dirt and checked the sky again. Their stomachs were calmer, but not full. Their hands were warmer, but still ready to grab rifles. The fire had saved them a little and threatened them at the same time. The hidden cook fire showed that even a hot meal could become a tactical risk when supply lines failed, and men had to feed themselves under enemy eyes. Some nights were too dangerous for flame, too watched for smoke, and too tense for even a tin of water to boil. Then the soldiers had to eat everything cold, hard, salty, greasy, or raw, until war itself began to taste like metal, old fat, and broken teeth. Cold food became its own kind of fatigue. A soldier could hold a tin of meat in one hand and a small knife in the other, trying to pry loose a slice that clung to the metal with white fat around the edge. The meat did not smell like a meal, and the biscuit beside it broke into dry crumbs before it softened in the mouth. Nothing about it felt finished. There were many reasons men ate this way. They had no safe fire, no spare time, no clean water, no fuel, and no wish to send smoke into the air for an enemy observer to notice. Sometimes the unit was moving too quickly to cook, and sometimes it was hiding too carefully to risk even a small flame. The ration had been designed for survival. It was not designed for comfort. Canned food and hard dry rations could last because they were tough, sealed, salted, compact, and simple to distribute. That was the point. A field kitchen could fail, but a tin in a pack might still be there when a man needed it. The army could not promise warmth, only calories. The insult of cold rations was that they kept a man alive while reminding him with every bite that being alive was not the same as being cared for. The fat stuck to the knife, the biscuit scratched the gums, the meat could taste like salt, metal, and old grease, with no steam, no softness, and no sense that anyone had prepared it for a tired human body. The mouth worked because the body had orders. After one day, the food was tolerable. After several days, it became harder to face. The same cold tin, the same dry biscuit, the same weak drink, and the same taste of metal could make a man look at his ration and feel tired before he even began eating. Hunger was still there, but appetite had gone somewhere else. That was the strange turn. A man could be hungry and still not want the food in front of him. His stomach might pull, his hands might shake slightly, and his body might need energy badly, yet the thought of another cold mouthful could make his throat tighten. War could make eating feel like a duty. Cold food also changed the body. Too much dry biscuit with too little water could leave a man constipated, cramped and heavy in the gut. Badly stored food, greasy meat, dirty hands, stress and exhaustion could push the body the other way into diarrhea and weakness. Either way, the ration did not simply pass through him like a clean solution. It left a record. In ordinary life, people often think of eating as rest. But here, eating could become another task done under discomfort. A soldier might crouch in grey light, cut meat with a blade used for other work, wipe crumbs from his palm, and swallow before the mouth was ready. He might drink less than he needed because the water bottle was low. He might save the last bite even though it had already gone stiff in the cold. A warm meal at home can make a bad day feel survivable. But these men could finish a ration and feel as if the day had only become slightly less dangerous. That difference mattered. Cold food did not gather men together in the same way a hot pot did. It did not soften the mood for long, and it did not make the unit feel connected to the rear. It filled mouths, not spirits. The taste stayed with them. Metal from the tin, salt from the meat, grease on the fingers, biscuit dust at the back of the throat, and the dull bitterness of tea or coffee stretched too thin. After enough days, men stopped describing food by what it was and began describing it by what it did to them. It stuck, scratch dried, turned, cramped or sat. Some men tried to improve it. They soaked biscuits when they had water, mixed crumbs with fat, warmed tins against the body, cut meat thinner, or traded pieces with someone who still had a different ration. Small changes mattered because the sameness itself became punishing. The body wanted variety almost as much as warmth, but there was rarely enough of either. A man who had marched, dug, waited and shivered could put the same cold ration into his mouth and know it would not repair him. It would give him enough to continue, perhaps, but not enough to recover. The next day would begin with less stored inside him than the last one had taken away. The quiet misery of this food was not in how terrible it looked, but in how normal it became after the men had lost the right to expect anything better. They could sit beside one another chewing in silence, each man alone with the same hard taste. No one needed to complain. The cracked biscuits, greasy knives, and scraped tins already said enough. By the time the meal ended, the ground might hold only crumbs and empty cans. The men wiped their blades, closed their packs, and forced themselves back into the day. Their stomachs were no longer fully empty, but their bodies did not feel restored. They had eaten, and somehow the hunger still seemed nearby. This was why cold rations could feel so cruel. They prevented collapse without offering relief. They kept the line moving, but they did not make the men feel fed in any deeper sense. The body survived, while the mind remembered what food used to be. Days of cold meat, hard biscuit and old grease showed that not starving was not the same as being properly fed. When water began to run low as well, even the dry ration left in a pocket became harder to swallow, harder to cook and harder to trust. A soldier could hold food in his hand and still sit helpless with a dry throat, unable to force down a single bite because his canteen gave no sound when he shook it. The canteen made no sound when the soldier shook it. He held it near his ear anyway, hoping for even the smallest splash, but the metal stayed quiet in his hand. Then he put a piece of hard biscuit into his mouth and let it sit there, waiting for saliva that barely came. He did not dare swallow too soon. Hunger was bad, but thirst changed the meaning of food. A biscuit that could help him stand became a lump that scraped his mouth. Salted meat became almost cruel because it pulled more water from a body that had little left to give. Even a ration in the hand could become useless if the throat was too dry to accept it. Water supply could be harder than the food supply in many conditions. Trucks could carry tins, sacks and crates, but water was heavy, bulky, and needed constant movement to reach men in deserts, islands, hot summers, sieges, ruined towns, and positions far from clean sources. A unit might find food in packs, houses, fields, or captured stores, but water had fewer safe substitutes. The body noticed quickly. The sharp little cruelty of thirst is that it can make a man stare at food like it has become another problem instead of an answer. He could hold a biscuit, a strip of meat, or a handful of dry grain, and know it contained energy. He could also know that swallowing it might hurt, worsen his thirst, or sit in his stomach like something unfinished. Food needed water to become useful. In war, drinking water came from many places. It might arrive by water truck, barrel, canteen, cart, well, stream, melted snow, rain collected in canvas, boiled water from a field kitchen, or local sources treated with tablets when the men had them. Each method had weaknesses. Trucks could be delayed, wells could be damaged, streams could be fouled, and boiling took fuel and time. That made every sip important. Men learned the weight of a full canteen and the lighter feel of one nearing empty. They listened to the sound it made when moved. They rationed mouthfuls, not because they were calm, but because the next source might be hours away. A dry throat made every decision sharper. Thirst also changed behavior inside the group. A man who had water left became visible, just like a man with bread had become visible earlier. Someone might ask for one swallow, then apologize before the answer comes. Someone else might pretend his canteen was empty to avoid sharing what he feared he would need later. Hunger made men quiet, but thirst made them irritable. The body gave warnings, lips cracked, the tongue felt thick, and headaches came with a hard pressure behind the eyes. Standing too quickly could bring dizziness. Urine darkened, sweat slowed, and the mind began to shorten its thoughts. A thirsty man could misunderstand an order, stumble on a march, or snap at someone over almost nothing. Dry rations became harder to use under those conditions. Biscuits needed soaking if they were too hard. Powdered drinks, tea or coffee need water. Salted food demanded more drinking afterward. Even cooking a few roots, grains or meat scraps depended on having enough water to spare, and no one wanted to pour the last of the canteen into a pot unless the group agreed. At home, a glass of water beside a plate is so ordinary that no one notices it, but on those roads, a single swallow could decide whether a man could eat at all. That is why thirst felt so intimate. It worked inside the mouth, the throat, the eyes, and the temper. It did not wait politely beside hunger, it stepped in front of it. Some men tried to trick the body. They held a biscuit in the mouth until it softened, took bites, breathed through the nose, or saved dry food for later when water might appear. Others drank too quickly when a source was finally found and regretted it soon after. The body wanted relief faster than caution could control it. The worst part was seeing water that could not be trusted. A ditch might hold rain. A shell hole might shine with muddy water. A broken pipe might leak into rubble. A stream might run close enough to hear. But no one could know what lay upstream, what bodies, animals, waste, fuel or disease had entered it before it reached them. Thirst made bad water look generous. Still men stared at it. They discussed it. They argued about boiling, tablets, filtering through cloth, or waiting for a safer source that might never come. The decision could divide a group because every man felt the dryness in his own throat. Patience becomes fragile when the mouth is cracked. The most frightening thing is how quickly thirst can make judgment feel personal. Because every refused sip sounds cruel, and every shared sip feels like a sacrifice. A man could know the rules of rationing and hate the hand that held the bottle away from him. He could know the water had to be saved and still think of taking it. Need made thought narrow. By evening, the soldier might still have food left. A biscuit in his pocket, a little meat in paper, a few crumbs in a tin. Yet he could not enjoy the fact that he had not run out, because eating it meant facing the dry scrape again. The canteen stayed silent beside him. He would shake it once more before sleeping, not because he expected water to appear, but because hope sometimes repeats useless actions. The sound did not come. His mouth remained dry. The empty canteen showed that food alone could not keep a soldier going when the throat, blood and mind were all asking for water. In some places, the problem changed again, because water was not absent at all. It was everywhere in shell holes, streams, mud, broken pipes and jungle puddles. A man could kneel in front of water shining in a bomb crater and still have to wonder whether one desperate drink would save him for an hour or destroy his body by morning. The water in the bomb crater looked almost calm. It held the grey sky on its surface, with pieces of brick, mud, and torn leaves lying around the edge. A few soldiers stood above it with empty canteens, staring longer than they should have, because their mouths had been dry since morning. No one reached down first. When the supply system failed, water came from wherever men could find it. A stream behind the trees, a well in an abandoned village, melted snow in a tin, rain caught in canvas, a broken pipe in a ruined street, or a pool gathered inside a shell hole could all become tempting. The problem was that war touched everything. Nothing stayed clean for long. Dirty water could save a man for an hour and punish him the next day. A soldier might drink because his throat burned, because his head ached, because his canteen was empty, and because the march ahead would not wait for safer water. Then the body might answer with cramps, fever, vomiting, or diarrhea. When he had no strength left to spare, the danger was delayed. There was a cruel trick in seeing water everywhere and still not knowing whether it was relief or another weapon aimed at the stomach. In mud, jungle, shattered towns, and crowded positions, water collected in places no one would have touched in ordinary life. It ran past latrines, dead animals, fuel spills, rotting food, broken drains and ground churned by boots and shellfire. A clear surface meant very little. Soldiers knew some ways to make water safer. They could boil it, use purification tablets when they had them, strain it through cloth, take it from upstream, melt snow, or trust wells that local people had used before the fighting. But all of those choices needed time, fuel, containers, knowledge, or calm. At the front, those things were often missing. That made every source a small argument. One man might say they should wait. Another might say waiting would make them too weak to move. Someone might point out the smell, the colour, the oil film, or the dead insect floating near the edge. Someone else might already be kneeling. Thirst shortened patience. It made caution sound like luxury. A man with cracked lips could understand disease in his mind and still lower his canteen toward brown water. He was not ignorant, he was desperate. In ordinary life, people trust water because it comes from a pipe, a bottle, or a clean tap, but these men had to judge a puddle with tired eyes while their bodies begged them to stop thinking. That difference matters. Clean water is invisible when it is reliable. When it disappears, every meal, march, wound, and hour of sleep becomes harder. The sickness that followed could break a man without a bullet. Diarrhea drained water from a body already short of it. Fever weakened the legs. Stomach pain bent a soldier double when he was supposed to carry equipment, hold a position, or keep pace with the unit. A sick man became a problem for everyone around him. This was not only discomfort. A soldier too weak to march slowed the group. A man running constantly to relieve himself could not stay hidden easily. A guard with cramps and dizziness might miss movement in the dark. Disease turned the body into another broken supply line. The most frightening part is that bad water did not need to look dramatic to do damage. It only needed to enter a tired body at the wrong time. A mouthful from a shell hole could feel like mercy in the moment. By night, the same man might be sweating under a coat, shaking, and unable to keep anything inside him. The body remembered what the thirst had made him. In cities, the problem could be especially cruel. Ruined pipes leaked into streets, drains broke open, rubble filled wells, and civilians needed the same water soldiers wanted. In forests and jungles, rain could fall constantly while safe drinking water remained uncertain. In winter, snow could surround a man and still require fire, a pot, and time before it became useful. Water was present, but not simple. Men learned to fear the stomach. They learned that a full canteen from the wrong place could be worse than an empty one for a few more hours. They learned to smell, watch, wait, and sometimes ignore their own caution because there was no better option. War turned thirst into a gamble. By the crater, the men might finally decide. One would fill his canteen. Another would turn away. A third would kneel, scoop water through a cloth, and tell himself that mud was not the same as poison. They all knew the truth was less comforting. The water went down warm, earthy, and wrong. It wet the mouth, eased the throat, and gave relief so immediate that doubt seemed almost ungrateful. For a few minutes, the body thanked him. Later, it might accuse him. The dirty water showed that survival could become a choice between suffering now and suffering worse later. Once thirst and hunger had weakened the men long enough, the next cruelty appeared inside the unit itself, where food had to be divided by duty, strength, wounds, and usefulness. In a surrounded position, a small full bag of flour could sit beside a list of wounded men, and everyone in the room would know there were more mouths than spoonfuls. Inside the bunker, a small bag of flour sat on the wooden table like an accusation. Beside it lay a list of wounded men, written in pencil, with names pressed hard into the paper because the hand that wrote them had been tired. A tin of water stood nearby, half full, and several soldiers watched the table without speaking. Everyone could see there were more mouths than spoonfuls. In a surrounded position, hunger stopped being only a private problem. It moved into the room, onto paper, into lists, and into decisions that someone had to make with other men watching. A guard needed strength to stay awake. A runner needed strength to carry messages. A man carrying ammunition needed strength in his legs, and the wounded needed food because bodies cannot heal from emptiness. The numbers did not fit. That where fairness began to change its meaning. In normal times, fair might mean every man received the same portion. Under siege, equal portions could make no sense if Simzevn had to fight. Some had to work, some could barely sit up, and some would not survive, no matter how much food they were given. The question became ugly because it sounded practical. There is a hard cruelty in any situation where a spoonful of flour can begin to look like a military decision. The person dividing it might be an officer, a cook, a medic, or simply the man left with the ration box and a pencil. He did not need to be cruel to make cruel choices. The siege had already made the choices smaller than the people in the room. In surrounded units, isolated pockets, trapped towns, and defensive positions cut off from supply, rations often had to be reduced little by little. At first, the cut might seem temporary. Then the next day brought another cut, and the next one made the old portion look generous. Men learned to measure hunger, smaller numbers. The strongest men sometimes received enough to keep working. The sick and wounded might receive extra if there was hope of recovery, or less if the command believed they could no longer contribute. Men on night watch making sentries could kill everyone. The logic could be explained. That did not make it easy to hear. A wounded soldier understood more than people wanted him to. He could see when the bowl came lighter. He could hear pauses before someone said his name. He could feel the room deciding whether he was a man being cared for or a burden being carried. That knowledge hurt differently. No one said it plainly. The healthy men were not free from pain either. A man given a larger share might eat with guilt, especially if someone nearby had a bandaged leg, a fever, or hands too weak to hold a cup. He needed the food to stand guard, but needing it did not make the other man less hungry. Duty and shame could sit in the same bowl. In a safer life, people argue about fairness as if there is enough for the argument to remain clean, but inside that bunker, fairness could mean deciding which hunger helped the group survive and which hunger had to be endured silently. That is not a moral lesson people like to imagine. It is a pressure system. It pushes decent men into decisions that feel indecent because the food has run out before the need has. The wounded list became more than a medical note. It became part of the ration plan. A man with a minor wound might be expected to return to duty, so his portion had value in the eyes of the unit. A man with a grave wound might be given comfort, but not enough to change his future. War made the body into a calculation. The most disturbing part is that nobody had to hate the weak for the weak to receive less. The shortage itself did the first act of cruelty. The men could care for one another and still divide the food unevenly. A medic could want to feed every patient and still know the guard post needed men awake. A cook could scrape the pot until the metal showed and still not create another serving. The meals became thinner. Flour mixed with water became a paste. Soup became a warm liquid, with almost nothing in it, and bread, if any remained, was cut so carefully that crumbs were guarded. Men watched the ladle. They listened for the scrape at the bottom of the pot. They learned the sound of shortage. Those who received less weakened faster. The already sick became colder, slower, and more silent. The wounded found it harder to heal. Men who still had duties felt their own strength dropping and wondered how long the system could keep pretending it was organized. The ration table became a map of decline. Tension did not always explode. Often it stayed quiet, which could be worse. A man might look away when another man received more. Someone might joke weakly and then stop. Someone might lick a spoon twice because there was nothing else to do with his mouth. Hunger made even silence feel crowded. The person dividing the food carried a private burden. If he gave too much to the wounded, the sentries might fail. If he fed the fighters first, men on stretchers mightn't understand what had happened, and if he divided equally, everyone might become too weak at once. Every answer had teeth. The pencil moved down the list again. A name, a duty, a wound, a portion. The flour bags sagged lower. The men kept watching. By then, the pain in the room was not only hunger, but the knowledge that survival had become something measured against another man's need. That is what a siege did. It did not simply trap bodies behind enemy lines. It trapped conscience inside arithmetic. When the portions were finally handed out, no one looked satisfied. The bowls were too light, the soup too thin, the bread too small, and the men too aware of what had been left unsaid. Some ate quickly because hunger overruled shame. Others ate slowly because the delay made the portion seem larger. Outside, the enemy might be quiet for the moment, but inside the bunker the pressure remained. Men still had to stand watch, carry ammunition, change bandages, boil water, and wait for relief that might not come. The food had been divided, but the problem had not been solved. It had only been postponed until the next meal. The ration table showed that siege hunger could turn fairness into a cold argument between duty, wounds, strength, and survival. When official portions became too small to hold the unit together, men began looking for food through unofficial paths, trading whatever still had value in a world where money meant less than bread. Soon a cigarette, a wristwatch, or even a wedding ring could lie beside a piece of dark bread, while its owner decided whether one more meal was worth one more piece of home. A cigarette lay on a broken brick beside a piece of dark bread. Near it, a soldier held an old wristwatch in his palm, keeping his fingers partly closed so no one farther down the ruined wall could see too clearly. The civilian across from him did not speak loudly, because hunger had made every trade feel dangerous. Both sides understood the price without needing many words. When official supply failed, value changed quickly. Money could become nearly useless if there were no shops, no stable prices, and no guarantee that anyone would sell food for paper. Small, useful things became a kind of battlefield currency instead. Cigarettes, alcohol, chocolate, canned food, knives, coats, watches, ammunition, and sometimes jewellery could move from hand to hand in exchange for bread, potatoes, eggs, milk, or anything that could be eaten. The trade looked simple from the outside. One object left one hand, food entered another, and both people stepped away before anyone else noticed. But the meaning was heavier than that. A soldier was not always paid with spare goods. Hunger has a way of turning personal belongings into calories, as if memory itself can be weighed against a loaf of bread. A watch might have come from a father. A ring might belong to a wife waiting somewhere beyond the front. A small photograph, a lighter, or a pocket knife might be the last ordinary thing a man still touched each day. Then, hunger asked what it was worth. In many war zones, informal exchange became part of daily survival. Soldiers traded with civilians, with other soldiers, with rear units, with prisoners, and with anyone who had access to something useful. The terms depended on danger, scarcity, discipline, and desperation. A cigarette could be cheap one day and valuable the next. The problem was that hunger made the trade uneven. A man with food had power. A man with an empty stomach had urgency. The bargain might still be voluntary, but one side needs to be pressed harder than the other. No one had to shout for the pressure to be clear. A soldier might tell himself he could live without the watch. Time meant little at the front anyway, where days were measured by shelling, guard shifts, marches, and the next meal. But when the bread was gone, and the wrist felt bare, the loss could suddenly become real. The body had been fed for one evening, while the past had been made smaller. Back in a normal town, a watch tells the hour, but in a hungry war zone, it could become one more thin slice of bread wrapped in dirty cloth. That change was not dramatic at first. The soldier chewed, swallowed, and felt stronger. Only later, when his hand went to his wrist by habit, did he remember what he had spent. Sometimes the trade happened between soldiers. One man had cigarettes but no food. Another had saved a tin but wanted tobacco badly enough to give up part of it. Someone with coffee might trade for sugar, while another with a clean pair of socks might barter for bread. Hunger created a small economy under the official war. Civilians lived inside that economy too, often with less protection. Some traded because they needed cigarettes, medicine, fuel, or military goods. Some traded because they were hungry as well, and had to exchange one kind of shortage for another. A family might give a piece of bread for soap, a little grain for chocolate, or eggs for a coat. Survival moved both ways. Still, the exchange could carry shame. A soldier might know the civilian needed the bread, too. The civilian might know the soldier was desperate. Both could avoid looking too long at the object passing between them. Hunger made privacy disappear. The bitter part is that these trades not only empty pockets, but they slowly strip away the proof that a man had once belonged to a life outside the war. First went the cigarettes, then the extra knife, then the watch, then perhaps the ring, if the hunger lasted long enough, and the next march required strength more urgently than memory required metal. A ring was different. It was small, but it could hold a whole home inside it. Giving it away for food did not mean love was gone. It meant the body had reached a place where love could not be eaten, carried as fuel, or used to keep the legs moving. That was a terrible kind of arithmetic. The bread gained from such a trade might be coarse, hard, dark, or stale. It might be gone in minutes. A man could divide it with a friend, hide it in his coat, or eat it too quickly because hunger had made patience weak. By night, the bread would be inside him, but the object he had traded would still be missing. He had bought time, not comfort. When supply lines collapsed, this was one of the quiet ways war entered the private self. It did not always tear things away with explosions. Sometimes it asked for them politely across a broken wall, one small object at a time. The soldier chose because not choosing meant staying hungry. The trade of cigarettes, watches, and rings showed that hunger could make a man pay for bread with pieces of the life he was trying to return to. But not every exchange stayed quiet, fair, or voluntary once armies remained hungry for too long. In the next village kitchen, a mother could stand before her last jar of flour while armed men at the door decided that her family's final meal now belonged to the war. The mother stood between the soldiers and the open flour jar. It was not full enough to hide anything, only a pale layer at the bottom, with a wooden scoop resting inside and dust on the rim. Behind her, a child watched a small piece of bread on the table as if staring hard enough could protect it. The kitchen had gone silent. This was one of the places where military hunger became civilian hunger. When supply lines failed, armies did not always wait politely for trucks to arrive. They looked to the villages, farms, cellars, barns, shops, and kitchens around them. Sometimes they paid, sometimes they requisitioned, sometimes they forced a price, and sometimes they simply took. The words could change, but the shelf became emptier. An officer might call it a necessary supply, a clerk might write it down, and a soldier might tell himself the food was needed for men at the front. The family standing in the room understood it more simply. Their food was leaving. The ugly truth is that a meal saving one soldier could be the same meal taken from a child who had no uniform, no weapon, and no say in the matter. A sack of flour was not only flour in that kitchen, it was tomorrow's bread, soup thickened for the evening, a little food stretched through the week, and the mother's last control over a world already broken by war. Losing it meant more than missing one meal. Requisitions happened in many places during World War II, with different levels of order, violence, and discipline depending on the army, the commander, the front, and the situation. Some soldiers followed paperwork. Some units bought food at poor prices. Others seized what they needed because they were hungry, trapped, advancing, retreating, or no longer controlled well enough by anyone behind them. For the soldier at the door, the act could still feel wrong. He might see the child's face, the small loaf, the thin hands of the mother, and know that this was not an enemy depot. This was not captured, supply stacked in crates. This was someone's home. That knowledge did not always stop him. A hungry unit needed food to keep moving, and military needs often spoke louder than private suffering. Men had orders, empty stomachs, and comrades waiting outside who had eaten too little for days. A soldier could hate the task and still carry the flour away. Shame did not refill the jar. In a peaceful town, taking food from a family kitchen would be called theft without much debate, but in a war zone, it could be dressed in papers, orders, stamps, or threats, until the act looked official from one side and ruinous from the other. That is how war enters ordinary rooms. It does not need to destroy the roof first. It can begin by removing the food from the table. The child might not understand requisition. He would understand the bread. He would understand his mother's hand holding him back, the soldier's boots on the floor, and the way adults stopped speaking in normal voices. Later, he would understand hunger. The most painful part is that the soldier could leave feeling less like a protector and more like another force the family had to survive. He might tell himself the army would return food later, that the family had more hidden somewhere, or that everyone had to sacrifice. Those thoughts helped him walk away. They did not help the people left behind. Civilian hunger grew through these small removals. One jar here, one chicken there, a sack of potatoes, a strip of bacon, a bucket of grain, a few eggs that were supposed to last until market day. Each loss might look small on an army report. Inside a household, it could change the next week. Resentment grew with it. A family that had once hoped the soldiers would pass quickly might begin to fear every knock. Villagers learned to hide food in walls, under floors, beneath straw, or in places children were told never to mention. Soldiers learned to search more carefully. Trust broke in both directions. The soldier who carried the bag back to his unit might receive thanks. The cook could turn the flour into paste, soup, or bread, so thin it barely held together. Men would eat, because hunger had the food necessary. No one outside that kitchen would see the mother measuring what was left. By night, the village might look quiet again. The soldiers had moved on or settled nearby. The road held mud and tracks, and the kitchen door was closed. Inside, the jar sat lighter than before. The child remembered where the bread had been. This part of hunger feels especially heavy because it shows that the supply collapse did not stay with soldiers. It spread into civilian areas and took food from people already trying to survive the same war. Once those kitchens, barns and family stores were emptied or too dangerous to touch, soldiers began looking toward another source, the food left behind by the enemy. In a dark warehouse beyond the village, crates of tins, flour, salted meat and bottles could look like salvation, until someone noticed the floorboards, wires and shadows that made every hungry hand stop. Inside the dark warehouse, the men stopped almost at the same time. Their flashlights moved across stacked tins, torn flour sacks, salted meat, bottles, crates, and boxes marked in a language some of them could not read. After days of thin portions, cold food, dirty water, and searching through civilian kitchens, the sight of so much food made the room feel unreal. Nobody rushed forward at first. Captured supplies could appear when armies moved quickly. A retreating force might abandon a depot because there was no time to load it. no fuel for the trucks, or no safe road left behind them. An advancing unit might reach a warehouse, railway store, farm depot, or supply column before its own field kitchen caught up. In that moment, enemy food became the nearest food. For hungry men, that could feel like rescue. Tins meant meat. Flour meant bread or thickened soup. Salted goods meant calories that could be carried. Bottles might mean something to drink, trade, or warm the blood for a few minutes in a ruined place. The body wanted to believe first. The dangerous part of hunger is that it can make a room full of enemy crates look less like a battlefield and more like a miracle with walls. A man who had chewed cold biscuit for days could stare at stacked food and forget, for 1 second, that the enemy had left it behind for a reason. Another mite stepped close before the officer raised a hand. Hope moved faster than caution. There were good reasons to wait. Depots could be mined before abandonment. Boxes could be damaged, spoiled, contaminated, or mixed with supplies that were not safe to consume. Bottles could be broken, tampered with, or simply too tempting for men who had gone too long without comfort. Even if the food itself was safe, the place could draw fire, patrols, or counterattack. So the men had to slow down. Someone checked the doorway. Someone looked at the floorboards. Someone moved a light across wires, loose planks, strange marks, and crates placed too neatly in the middle of a room. Food had become another object to be suspected. The stomach had to wait behind the eyes. That was difficult. A hungry man is not patient by nature. He sees a tin and thinks of opening it, not of tripwires. He sees flour and thinks of soup, not of whether the sack hides a charge beneath it. His body wants the room to be honest. It might not be. In mobile warfare, abandoned stores and captured transport could keep units alive. Trucks loaded with rations, railway cars, field depots, or enemy stocks might be used because official supply was still far behind. Soldiers often lived on what could be seized, found, or redirected during fast movement. But every captured store came with uncertainty. In a peaceful life, finding a pantry full of food means relief. But in that warehouse, the men had to ask whether the first opened crate might be the thing that killed them. The difference was not imagination. It was a procedure learned by fear. A careless hand could bring down part of the room before anyone tasted a bite. If the warehouse proved safe, the mood changed carefully. Men opened tins, lifted sacks, checked labels, and passed food back through the doorway. The silence broke into short words and practical orders. Nobody wanted chaos bait because chaos wasted supplies. Even joy had to be organised. The first meal from captured stores could feel strange. The food might be unfamiliar, too salty, too rich, or simply different from what the men knew. Some ate quickly because their bodies had waited too long. Others hesitated at enemy labels, not because they were proud, but because war had made everything foreign feel slightly suspect. Hunger usually won. There could be alcohol too, and that brought another danger. A bottle after days of fear and weakness might seem like comfort, but it could make men careless, sick, loud, or slow. Commanders often feared drinking in captured stores because hungry and exhausted soldiers could lose discipline at the exact moment they needed control. A miracle could loosen the unit. The quiet unease comes from watching men stand close to real food and still not being allowed to trust it. They had reached what they wanted, but the war had followed them inside the warehouse. It was on the floor, the labels, the shadows, the bottles, and the delay before anyone could eat. Even abundance had to be inspected. When the food was finally distributed, the men might receive more than they had seen in days. A tin of meat, a piece of bread made from captured flour, a little salt, perhaps a mouthful of something sweet or strong. It should have felt simple. It did not. The body did not always accept sudden plenty with gratitude. A stomach tightened by hunger could react badly to heavy food, rich meat, too much bread, or alcohol. Men who had been living on scraps could eat too fast because the mind feared the food might vanish again. Relief could turn into pain. For now, though, the warehouse gave them what the road had taken away. It gave weight to packs, heat to future pots, and a reason for men to stop staring at one another's crumbs. The unit could move with more confidence because food had returned, even if it came from the enemy's abandoned shelves. Survival did not care whose label was on the tin. The men left the warehouse carrying crates. But they also carried the lesson. In war, even food found in abundance could not be innocent. It had to be checked, guarded, counted, and feared before it could be eaten. Hunger had led them to the door, but caution kept them alive inside it. The captured warehouse showed that food could appear to be salvation and still harbour wires, poison, spoilage, or a careless mistake hidden among the crates. Once the stores were judged safe, another danger waited in the soldiers' own bodies, weakened by days of hunger and ready to betray them the moment food returned too quickly. Beside those same crates, one man could cram bread into his mouth, swallow too fast, then fold against the wall as his stomach twisted harder than it had during the empty days. Besides the captured crates, one soldier pushed bread into his mouth too quickly. He drank water after it, tore another piece before the first had gone down properly, and reached the meat because the sight of food had made caution disappear. For several minutes he looked like a man being rescued by the thing he had needed most. Then he sat down against the wall and folded over his stomach. Finding food did not mean the body was ready for it. After days of short meals, cold rations, thirst, marching, fear and poor sleep, a soldier's stomach could feel smaller, tighter, and less able to handle a sudden load. Hunger made the mind urgent, but the body still worked slowly. Relief could arrive too fast. A man who had eaten almost nothing for days did not always recover by eating everything in front of him. Heavy bread, salted meat, fat, alcohol, and too much water could hit the gut like another kind of shock. The stomach cramped, the mouth watered in the wrong way, and the first feeling of rescue turned into pain. Food became an attack from inside. As the men sit among the opened crates, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe if these slow war history stories help you settle in. It lets small forgotten moments like this travel a little farther from one quiet listener to another. There is a cruel kind of embarrassment in finally getting food and then discovering that your own body can no longer receive it properly. The soldier might try to hide the pain at first because men around him were still eating. He might press a hand to his belly, breathe through his nose, and pretend he only needed a moment. Then the cramp would tighten again. This happened because starvation and irregular eating changed the body before anyone could see it clearly. The muscles weakened, digestion slowed, water balance was disturbed, and the gut became sensitive to food that would once have seemed ordinary. A meal after deprivation was not just a meal. It was a test. The soldier might vomit before the food had done him any good. He might get diarrhea later, losing more water than he had just taken in. He might become dizzy, weak, sweaty, and unable to stand in line when the unit needed to move. The bread that looked like salvation could leave him less useful than before he ate it. That was the part men hated. They had waited for food. They had searched for it, traded for it, risked fire for it, and perhaps taken it from places that left shame behind. When it finally came, the body did not reward them with strength at once. It punished the rush. In ordinary life, eating too fast might mean discomfort and regret, but in that warehouse or bunker, it could mean falling behind the march, missing a guard shift, or becoming another burden for men already short of strength. The stakes were different. A cramped stomach was not a small inconvenience. It could change whether a man could carry his rifle. The body did not care how badly he needed to keep moving. A careful man might try to eat slowly, but hunger made that difficult. The eyes saw stacks of food, and the mind feared that it might be taken away, counted, spoiled, ordered elsewhere, or lost in another attack. Men who had been denied food often ate, as if the next hand might remove the plate. Speed felt like safety. Even officers and medics could struggle to control the rush. They might tell men to slow down, divide portions, water soup, or hold back the heaviest food until later. But command sounds thin when a starving man has bread in his hands. Hunger is not patient with instructions. The sad truth is that a starving body sometimes needs mercy delivered in small mouthfuls, not abundance dropped in front of it all at once. A little soup, a small piece of bread, a pause, a drink measured carefully, and then another portion later could help more than a pile of food eaten in panic. But war rarely created ideal conditions for gentle recovery. It delivered food late, in rough places, to men already beyond restraint. Inside the warehouse, the signs were plain. Broken bread lay near open tins. A bottle had rolled under a crate. Someone laughed too loudly from relief, while another sat pale and silent with his arms around his stomach. The room smelled of meat, flour, damp wood, sweat, and sudden hope that had turned uneven. Some men recovered after the first pain, others did not. Vomiting and diarrhea could strip away water, salts and strength, especially when clean water was already scarce. A man who had needed food to march might now need help just to stand. His own stomach had become another failed supply line. What makes this moment hard to forget is not greed, but the fear behind it, because the men were eating fast not for pleasure, but because hunger had taught them that food could vanish without warning. That fear did not leave when crates appeared. It stayed in the hands, in the mouth, and in the speed of swallowing. The body remembered a shortage even in the middle of plenty. By night, the captured food might be counted and guarded. Portions might be reduced again, not because there was no food, but because too much at once had already hurt some of the men. The same bread that brought relief now had to be managed like medicine. Nobody liked that lesson. A soldier could sit near the wall, breathing through pain, with crumbs on his coat and shame in his face. He had not meant to be foolish. He had simply eaten like a hungry man. War made even that dangerous. The first full meal after hunger showed that finding food did not always mean the body could recover at once. When plenty disappeared again, some battlefields pushed men even lower, scraps so thin and ugly they barely deserved the name of food. Soon a pot might hold only cloudy water, boiled bones, potato skins, and a few floating spots of fat, while every man waited for his share as if that grey liquid could carry him through one more night. The pot did not look like it was cooking a meal. It held cloudy water, a few potato skins, pieces of bone that had already been boiled once, and a thin layer of fat moving slowly across the surface. The men stood near it with their tin bowls ready, watching the liquid more than they watched one another. Nobody expected to feel full. By this stage, food had stopped meaning bread, meat, soup, or anything that looked complete. It meant whatever could give the body a little heat and a few more calories before night came down again. Bones were boiled a second time, skins were saved, Fat was scraped from tins, and flour dust was shaken from the bottom of sacks. Nothing was too small to notice. This was common logic when the supply collapsed for too long. A field kitchen that once fed men with proper portions could become a place where scraps were stretched with water until they barely held shape. Cooks did not need imagination as much as patience. They had to make less look like something. There is a bleak honesty in a meal so thin that everyone can see the bottom of the pot and still waits for their share. The men understood what was happening. No one believed the potato skins were enough, or that bones boiled twice could give back real strength. They waited anyway, because the body did not ask for pride. It asked for something warm. The taste could be weak, greasy, bitter, and dirty at once. A man might lift the bowl, smell more smoke than food, and drink because chewing was no longer part of the meal. A strip of skin or a floating scrap of fat could become the best thing in the bowl. The rest was warm water pretending to be supper. That was the point. It was not meant to satisfy. It was meant to delay the collapse. In a siege, a retreat, or an isolated position, the kitchen became a place of stretching. Water made every ingredient go farther. Bones were cracked or boiled again. Fat was saved instead of being thrown away. Vegetable peels, stale crumbs, flour dust, and scraps from earlier meals were treated like supplies rather than waste. Back in a safe kitchen, potato skins and boiled bones often mean the meal is already finished, but here they could become the meal itself. That shift shows how completely war could lower the standard of survival. The men were not choosing poor food because they accepted misery easily. They were eating the only thing left between them and another empty night. The body changed after meals, like this. Face size narrowed, eyes looked deeper, and men felt colder more quickly because there was not enough fuel inside them. A soldier could stand near a fire and still shiver. He could carry ammunition, dig, or keep watch, but every movement drew from a smaller reserve than the day before. Sickness came more easily too. Thin food did not rebuild the body well, and poor nutrition made wounds slower to heal. Men became more vulnerable to cold, infection, exhaustion, and the small illnesses that a stronger body might have resisted. Hunger did not always strike suddenly. Often, it wore men down in quiet layers. The hardest thing to watch is not the empty bowl, but the way men learn to accept almost nothing as if it is still a ration. They lined up without much argument, because arguing could not thicken the soup. They held their bowls carefully, because spilling even a few mouthfuls felt foolish. They drank slowly when they could, trying to make warmth last longer than the food itself. The cook suffered in his own way. He had to look into the pot and know it was not enough. He had to scrape, stir, divide, and hand out portions that would leave men hungry before the hour was over. The men might blame the war, the officers, the road, the weather, or the enemy, but the cook still had to be the hand that gave them too little. There were small humiliations in it. A man might search his bowl for a piece of fat and feel relief when he found one. Another might tilt the bowl to catch the last cloudy drops. Someone might run a finger along the inside of the tin after finishing, then pretend he had only been cleaning it. Hunger made these actions ordinary. By night, the warmth faded quickly. The bowl that had helped for a few minutes could not carry the body far. Men lay down with stomachs no longer sharp but still not satisfied, listening to others shift in the dark. The meal had passed through them like a promise too weak to keep. Still, the pot mattered. It kept the group organized. It gave men a place to gather, a reason to wait, and a sign that someone was still trying to feed them. Even a thin soup could hold the line together for one more evening. Not well, but enough. What remains in this kind of meal is the small human refusal to give up, even when the food has become water, bones, skins, and floating fat. The men knew the bowl would not restore them. They knew tomorrow would ask for more than tonight had given. But they drank because a body at war keeps bargaining with the smallest forms of help. The pot emptied slowly, then suddenly. Only scraps clung to the sides. The cook poured water into it again to loosen what remained, because even the residue had value now. The men watched that too. The thin soup showed that when every proper ration vanished, soldiers could be kept moving by bones boiled twice, potato skins and grease floating on dirty water. Beyond these desperate kitchens, another kind of hunger waited for units stretched too far from their own depots and roads. On some fronts, men could be winning ground on the map while sitting beside empty trucks because victory itself had outrun the food meant to feed them. The map on the hood of the truck looked cleaner than the road in front of it. A red line had been drawn far beyond the last village, past a damaged bridge, and toward the next place the unit was supposed to reach before the enemy had time to settle again. But beside that same truck, the ration boxes were nearly empty. The fuel cans had been turned upside down, and the men sat in the dust with hard biscuits instead of a cooked meal. The advance looked good on paper. The men were still hungry. Fast movement could create a supply problem of its own. An army might break through, push forward, and gain ground faster than its trucks, kitchens, fuel, and repair teams could follow. A road that looked open on a map could be blocked by wrecked vehicles, broken bridges, shell holes, mud, refugees, prisoners, or traffic from other units moving in the same direction. Food had to travel through all of that before it reached a bowl. This happened in many forms during World War II. In North Africa, long distances and poor roads made supply difficult, even when the front seemed to be moving well. In Eastern Europe, mud, snow, destroyed railways, and huge distances could slow food and fuel behind the fighting troops. In Western Europe, after landings and breakthroughs, forward units could move faster than supplies, coming from ports, beaches, depots, and crowded roads. The fighting moved ahead, but the meal stayed behind. There was a bitter joke in being told the operation was going well, while a man sat beside an empty ration tin and tried to make one biscuit last until morning. Soldiers could hear that the enemy was falling back. They could see abandoned positions, open roads, and officers pointing farther down the route, but none of that put soup in a pot. A captured mile could not be chewed. The problem was not always that food did not exist. Often it existed somewhere behind them, stacked at a depot, unloaded near a beach, waiting at a railhead, or packed on trucks that had not caught up. Fuel might be needed first for tanks, guns, and ammunition vehicles. Field kitchens might be stuck behind traffic or stopped by roads too damaged for heavy movement. The men at the front only knew the kitchen was not there. That made the hunger feel different from hunger in a siege. In a siege, the men knew they were trapped. In a retreat, they knew things were going badly. During an advance, hunger felt almost insulting, because the army was winning ground while the men doing the work were eating worse each day. Success did not fill the stomach. The soldiers adjusted because they had no choice. They stretched old rations, split biscuits, saved tins, searched abandoned farms, took food from local stores when they could, and traded small items with civilians or other units. Some waited beside the road and watched every truck that appeared in the dust, hoping it carried food instead of another order to keep moving. Hope became practical. A man could understand the larger plan and still be angry at his own empty bowl. He knew speed mattered. He knew the enemy might recover if they stopped too long. He knew officers wanted pressure kept on the retreating forces. But knowing all of that did not make dry bread softer or make an empty canteen heavier. At home, a long day usually ends with food waiting somewhere, but on that road, a successful day could end with the men checking pockets for crumbs. That was the part that wore them down. They had done what they were told. They had moved forward, carried weapons, guarded roads, and followed the map. The reward was another cold mouthful and another night of waiting for trucks. Sometimes the whole advance slowed for reasons that had little to do with enemy fire. A unit could have men ready, weapons ready, and orders ready, but still be stuck because the fuel had not arrived. A field kitchen could be close enough to be talked about, but too far away to feed anyone. Drivers could sit behind broken bridges while men ahead of them counted the last tins. War often stopped in dull ways. That dullness made it harder to accept. No dramatic shell burst explained the empty meal. No enemy charge took the food away. It seemed not there because roads were bad, trucks were late, bridges were broken, and fuel had been used somewhere else first. The cause was ordinary, which made it more frustrating. The men felt the shortage in small ways. They stood more slowly after resting. They kept dry food longer in their mouths to make it last. They became sharper with one another over pieces of bread, cigarettes, or water. A hungry unit could still move, but it moved with less patience. The hard truth is that a front line can look strong from a headquarters map while the men inside it are already being thinned out by missed meals. A red arrow showed movement. It did not show a man's legs shaking when he stood, or the cook opening a box and finding almost nothing left. It did not show the small anger of being told to move again before anyone had eaten properly. By evening, the officers might still talk about the next objective. The map might be folded, marked again, and passed from hand to hand. The men would listen, because listening was part of being soldiers. Then they would check their packs. Some would find half a biscuit. Some would find an old tin. Some would find nothing useful and pretend not to care. Along the road, trucks sat with empty fuel cans beside them, and the field kitchen still had not arrived. The army had moved forward, but supper had not. This was one of the plainest lessons of the war. Winning ground did not automatically feed the men who won it. A unit needed roads, drivers, fuel, bridges, depots, repair crews, and kitchens moving behind it every day. Without that, victory became another way to become tired and hungry. The fast advance showed that even success could leave soldiers sitting beside empty trucks, eating old rations while the map said they were winning. When movement turned into retreat, hunger became rougher and more hurried, because men began dropping food simply to get away alive. In the next road of mud and smoke, a soldier could watch flour spill from a torn sack, keep running, and only after dark understand that he had left tomorrow's meal behind him. Mud pulled at every boot on the retreat road. A sack of flour had split open near a wheel track. A crate of canned meat had fallen from a wagon, and white dust mixed with brown water under the boots of men who no longer had time to pick anything up. One soldier turned his head for a second, saw the food spilling into the road, and then kept moving, because the shell burst behind him were getting closer. He chose the road ahead over tomorrow's meal. That was how food disappeared during a retreat. It did not always happen through planning or ration cuts. Sometimes it vanished because the unit had to move too fast. After all, horses were down because trucks were stuck. After all, the road was under fire, or because some wounded men had to be carried before sacks and kitchen gear could be saved. In those moments, survival became the first order, and everything heavy became a burden. A retreat forced cruel priorities. Weapons had to be kept if possible. Ammunition had to come along if any fight still lay ahead. Wounded men had to be lifted, dragged, or loaded somehow. Food, especially in bulk, could be too heavy, too slow, and too awkward. A flour sack could tear, a soup pot could bounce loose, a box of tins could be left behind because there were only so many hands. That was the hard part. A man could see useful food right there, know exactly what it meant, and still leave it in the road because staying longer might mean being trapped, shelled, or surrounded. The body understood the loss at once, but fear pushed the legs forward anyway. There was no time to mourn bread in daylight. There is something especially bitter about watching tomorrow's food fall into the mud, while knowing you are doing the sensible thing by not stopping. Nobody needed to explain the choice. If a wagon had to be lightened, the sack went first. If a truck was bogged down and shells were walking closer, crates were thrown aside. If a field kitchen could not be pulled free, it might be abandoned with the pot still inside. Retreats in World War II often broke supply systems faster than advances did. Depots were lost, stores were burned, kitchen equipment was left beside roads, and supply trucks fell behind, broke down, or were captured. Men who had eaten little already could find themselves moving away from the last organised food they might see for days. Retreat turned shortage into disorder. At first, the men did not always feel the full cost. In the first hour, the mind stayed fixed on distance, direction, enemy, pressure, and who had fallen behind. Someone still had a biscuit in his pocket. Someone else had half a tin. Another man had shoved a small piece of bread into his coat before the column broke apart. Those little things made the loss of the larger load seem less immediate. The evening came. By then, the group might finally stop in a ditch, a tree line, a ruined barn, or the edge of a village. Men checked what was left and discovered the real damage. No kitchen, no flour sack, no pot is worth boiling anything in, no crate of tins, perhaps not even enough dry fuel to warm water if they had found some. The unit was alive, but its food had been scattered across the road behind it. Back in ordinary life, dropping food is a small annoyance. But on a retreat road, one torn sack could mean that 20 men go to sleep hungry after surviving the day. That was why the regret grew later, not at the moment of running, because there was no room in the mind for regret then, but after dark, when the shells sounded farther away, and the stomach began to ask what had been saved. Some men became angry, not loudly, because tired anger often comes out flat, but in clipped voices and short movements. One blamed the road, another blamed the officers for leaving too late. Another blamed the driver who had tipped the wagon. Most of them knew blame would not bring the food back. Hunger still wanted a target. Others went quiet. They sat with what they had managed to keep, maybe a bit of biscuit dust wrapped in paper, maybe one tin dented but unopened, maybe nothing at all except water if they were lucky. The retreat had taken away the idea that food would arrive in a proper way. Now everything depended on chance, pockets, and what could be found in the dark. The men who had carried the wounded felt another kind of strain. They had helped save lives, but they often had the least room for food in their hands. Stretchers, rifles, bandages, and bodies had filled the space that once held rations or kitchen gear. No one could say that was the wrong choice. Yet the hunger remained. What stays heavy in this kind of retreat is not only the fear of being caught, but the delayed pain of understanding that survival tonight may have already made tomorrow weaker. The man who kept running had done the right thing. He was not a fool for leaving the sack. He was a soldier trying to stay alive. But once the dark settled and the belly stayed empty, the spilled flour on the road came back into his mind with painful clarity. By night, the retreat column might be smaller, quieter, and thinner than it had been that morning. Men lie down without cooking. Some chewed what little they had. Some pretended sleep would silence hunger. Some thought about the crate, the sack, the kitchen, or the bread left behind in the mud, because stopping for it would have meant death or capture. This was the plain truth of retreat. You could save your life in 1 hour and lose the means to sustain it in the next. The road demanded speed first. Hunger came back later to collect the cost. The retreat road showed that food was often abandoned not because it had no value, but because staying with it for even 1 minute longer could get a man killed. Once the column broke apart and the kitchens vanished behind them, the people who suffered the hunger most quietly were often the wounded who could not search, carry, or bargain for themselves. The next shelter could hold a man on a stretcher with dry lips and an empty stomach, while the last bowl of thin soup passed first to those still strong enough to stand. The wounded man lay on a wooden stretcher with his coat folded under his head. His lips were dry, his face had the flat colour of exhaustion, and one hand rested near the bandage, as if he was afraid the pain would move if he shifted too much. A bowl of thin soup passed from one standing man to another nearby, but he could not reach for it himself. He had to wait. That was the quiet cruelty of hunger in a dressing station. The wounded often needed food badly because the body could not heal on an empty stomach. Blood loss, fever, shock, infection, cold and pain all demanded strength, and strength had to come from somewhere. But the wounded man was also the least able to search, bargain, cook, carry, or push himself toward the next ration. He depended on others for everything. A medic had to bring water. A nurse had to lift his head. A comrade had to remember him after feeding those who could still stand. If the unit was retreating, surrounded, or cut off from supplies, that dependence became dangerous. Kindness needed food to work with. There is a painful unfairness in needing a meal most when your own hands can no longer fight for it. A man lying on a stretcher could smell soup before he tasted it. He could hear tins opening, boots moving, and men swallowing nearby. He could understand that the stronger men might be fed first because they had to guard the position, carry ammunition, or move the wounded again. Understanding did not fill his stomach. Frontline aid posts often worked with too little. They could lack hot food, clean water, medicine, bandages, blankets, stretchers, and transport all at the same time. When supply lines broke, medical places suffered in quiet ways because they needed everything the fighting units needed, plus more. A wounded man needed food, but also warmth, dressing changes, and a way out. Each shortage made the others worse. The medic could clean a wound and still have no bread to give. He could tighten a bandage, check a fever, and pour a careful mouthful of water from a bottle already almost empty. His hands might be steady while his face gave nothing away. Inside, he knew the problem was larger than skill. He could not make food appear. In ordinary life, people often imagine care as something soft, with clean sheets, warm drinks, someone nearby with time to help. In a broken field station, care might mean a muddy blanket, a few spoonfuls of soup, and a medic deciding whether the water should go to the man burning with fever or the man still able to walk. The choices were small only in size. They were heavy in meaning. A wounded man who missed food did not simply feel hungry. He weakened faster. His body had less strength to fight infection, less heat to resist cold, and less patience for pain. His mind could sink into a dull place where every sound seemed far away. Hunger joined the wound. The most bitter part is that the wound made him visible, but the shortage made his need easy to postpone. Men could see he was hurt. They could step around his stretcher carefully. They could lower their voices near him. Yet when the bowl was nearly empty, the logic of survival might still move the food toward those who could stand guard. That did not always come from cruelty. A unit in danger needed men on their feet. If the guard failed, everyone in the shelter might die. If ammunition was not carried, the position might break. If stretcher bearers collapsed, the wounded would be left behind. Hunger made compassion argue with duty. The wound understood that argument from below. They watched boots, hands, bowls, bottles, and faces. They knew when someone avoided their eyes. They knew when the portion was smaller than it had been the day before. They knew when the medic pretended the soup was warmer or thicker than it was. A spoonful could become humiliating. The man might need help lifting his head, opening his mouth, swallowing without coughing, or keeping the food down. Soup might run onto his chin because his body was too weak to manage a simple act. Someone would wipe it away quickly, and both men might pretend it had not happened. Pride had little room on a stretcher. What stays with this scene is the helplessness of the caregiver. Because he can hold a cup to a man's lips and still know the cup almost empty. He may want to give more. He may even save his own portion for someone worse off. But one sacrifice cannot feed a station full of wounded men. Mercy also runs out. By evening, the shelter grew colder. The wounded lay close together, some sleeping, some staring, some asking for water in voices too low to sound demanding. The medic moved between them with a bottle that felt lighter each time. Outside, men still had to keep watch, and inside, bodies tried to heal without enough help. The soup did reach the man on the stretcher eventually. A few spoonfuls, thin and barely warm, he swallowed slowly. Not because he wanted to make it last, but because swallowing hurt and his mouth was dry. When the bowl moved away, his stomach was still empty enough to notice. That was the truth of hunger among the wounded. The men who needed rebuilding often received only enough to keep them from slipping faster. They were not forgotten, not always. But being remembered did not create supplies. War could leave compassion standing beside a stretcher, with nothing useful in its hands. The wounded man on the stretcher showed that hunger did not fall equally, because the weakest bodies often had the least power to reach the food they needed. Far from these cold aid posts, another kind of shortage waited on islands and in jungle camps where distance, rain, insects and heat attacked the rations before a soldier could even eat them. That wet green darkness could soften bread with mold, gather ants along food bags, and leave a man opening his ration, only to find the jungle had reached it first. Rain changed the food before the soldier even opened it. Under a leaking sheet of canvas, he held a damp ration packet in both hands, while water ran from the edge of his helmet and down his sleeves. The biscuit inside had gone soft at the corners, the paper clung to it, and small ants moved along the fold of the bag as if they had found it first. Nothing stayed dry for long. This was a different kind of hunger from the cold roads and broken towns of Europe. On islands, in jungle camps, and across wet Pacific or Southeast Asian terrain, food had to fight the climate before it reached the mouth. Heat softened it, rain soaked it, insects entered it. Mold grew quickly, and long sea routes or rough tracks made replacement slow. A ration could arrive late and already feel old. The men still needed it. They had marched, dug, carried ammunition, watched tree lines, and slept badly in wet clothes that never fully dried. Their bodies needed salt, calories, clean water, and something fresh, but the environment gave them damp packaging, spoiled smells, and food that looked suspicious even when it was officially issued. Hunger in the jungle was sticky. The cruel detail was not only that the men had too little food, but that the food they did have could seem to rot while they were still holding it. A biscuit that should have snapped now bends. Rice could smell sour. Flour could clump. Meat tins could rust around the edges. And anything sweet could draw insects almost at once. The ration was not safe simply because it existed. Both Allied and Japanese troops faced supply problems in tropical and island fighting, though not in the same way and not under the same conditions. Distance over water, damaged shipping, bad roads, air attacks, jungle terrain, disease and weather could all make food delivery difficult. Some units received better supplies than others, but the same basic truth remained. The environment was another enemy. A soldier might open a ration and pause before eating, not because he was delicate, but because the smell had changed or the surface looked wrong. He might scrape away mold, shake ants from a bag, break off the worst part, and eat the rest because there was no replacement waiting. The mouth learned disgust as part of survival. Warm climates also punished the body in ways cold hunger did not. Sweat took salt, dirty water brought sickness. Insects made rest difficult. Diarrhea, fever, and poor food could drain a man until he lost weight, even while still receiving something to eat. A soldier could be fed on paper and still shrink in the field. That was common in long jungle fighting. Men could develop shortages of vitamins, lose appetite, grow weak from stomach illness, or become unable to face the same damp ration again. Food that should have supported them became something they forced down between nausea and exhaustion. The problem was not only hunger. It was the failure of food to feel trustworthy. In a dry storeroom, a ration looks like an order, but under jungle rain, it could have become a damp packet of doubt, insects, and bad smell. That changed morale. Men did not just ask whether there was food. They asked whether it was still edible, whether there was enough water to cook it, and whether anything in the jungle had spoiled it before they could use it. Some soldiers turned to local food when possible. Coconuts, fish, rice, fruit, roots, or anything gathered from nearby villages, beaches, rivers, or forests could help in certain places. But local food was uneven, difficult to obtain, sometimes unsafe, and often tied to civilians who were suffering their own shortages. The jungle did not become generous just because men were hungry. Cooking was also harder. Rain made fire difficult, smoke could still reveal a position, and wet fuel burned badly. A pot of rice could take longer than expected, and a little food could be lost to mud, insects, or dirty hands before anyone ate. Even a meal that succeeded came with irritation. Everything felt damp. The men became worn down by texture as much as shortage. Soft biscuit, sour rice, rusted tins, wet paper, gritty meat, and insects brushed from food before eating could make every meal feel unpleasant. They were not asking for luxury. They wanted food that did not seem to have been claimed by the place before them. What makes this hunger feel different is the constant wetness, because the soldier is not only fighting an empty stomach, he is fighting mold, ants, rot, fever, and the smell of damp cloth around every meal. Cold hunger makes men stiff and hollow. Jungle hunger makes them sticky, angry, itchy, and tired in a way that settles into the skin. The body has no clean edge left. By evening, the rain might still be falling on the canvas. Men sat close under it, knees drawn in, trying to keep packets off the mud while ants found new routes over boots and bags. Someone scraped mold from a biscuit. Someone else stared at a tin before opening it, already expecting disappointment. The meal would be eaten anyway. A bad ration could still be better than none. A sour smell could still be ignored if the march at dawn demanded strength. Hunger did not leave because the food looked wrong. The jungle ration showed that supply collapse was not only about empty crates, because heat, rain, insects and mold could damage food before it ever reached a hungry mouth. This also makes it dangerous to speak about all World War II soldiers as if they suffered the same kind of hunger, because each army and each front had its own shortages, habits, and breaking points. On the next table, an American ration tin, German black bread, Soviet porridge, British tea, and Japanese rice could sit side by side, proving that the question of what soldiers ate had no single answer. That wet ration in the jungle was only one version of hunger. Somewhere else in the same war, another soldier sat beside an American ration tin and still waited for the kitchen truck that had not caught up. Far away, a German soldier cut dark bread into thinner slices near a wagon that had fuel for neither cooking nor movement. In another sector, a Soviet soldier stirred watery porridge in a dented bowl while the smoke from the field kitchen drifted low over frozen ground. It was all the same war, but it was not the same meal. A British soldier might hold a mug of weak tea with both hands, less because it tasted good, and more because the warmth made the day feel slightly more organised. On an island track, a Japanese soldier might count a small portion of rice in his palm and understand that the sea behind him had become part of the enemy. These men were connected by uniforms, orders, fear, weather, and distance. They were not fed by the same system. That is why the question of what World War II soldiers ate has no single clean answer. Hunger in Stalingrad did not look like hunger on Guadalcanal. A tank crew in North Africa faced a different problem from an infantryman in the Ardennes. A man near a working field kitchen lived in a different world from a man beyond the last road. The mistake is to imagine one hungry soldier with one hard biscuit and use him to explain the whole war. That image can be true, but only in the right place. Some men missed hot meals for a few days. Others lived on tins, rice, black bread, watery soup, roots, horse meat, spoiled food, or almost nothing useful at all. Every army carried its own road behind the meal. Industry, shipping, railways, trucks, horses, ports, fuel, weather, local terrain, and command discipline all shaped what reached the front. A ration was never just food. It was the end of a long chain. The American soldier with the tin might have belonged to an army with strong industrial supply and packaged rations, but that did not mean his meal always arrived on time. Beaches could jam, roads could break, storms could delay ships, and fast advances could leave food behind the men who needed it. A crate in the rear did not help a hungry man at the front. Distance made plenty useless. The German soldier with dark bread had another kind of problem. In one campaign, food might come through field kitchens, captured stores, wagons, and local requisition. In another year, on another front, the same system might be strained by fuel shortages, bombed railways, retreat, distance, and the loss of control over roads. The bread in his hand could be routine, or it could be the last firm food he had seen that day. The Soviet soldier with porridge lived inside another pattern again. When the kitchen worked, hot kasha bread, soup, tea and preserved foods could keep a unit steady through cold and exhaustion. When encirclement, winter, destroyed villages, and long marches broke that system, the same soldier might search frozen ground or ruined houses like anyone else. A hot bowl could be normal in one place and precious in another. One spoonful of porridge could mean routine for a man near the kitchen and mercy for a man who had gone 2 days on scraps. That difference is easy to miss if the war is described too broadly. The front mattered. The season mattered. The ear mattered. The road behind the soldier mattered most of all. The British soldier with tea showed how habit could survive hardship. Tea, biscuit, tinned goods, field gins and long supply routes shaped his meals across deserts, ports, mountains and wet roads. A mug of tea might be ordinary on a calm day, then become something close to comfort after cold rations and bad sleep. The same drink could carry a different weight depending on how hungry the man holding it had become. The Japanese soldier counting rice faced some of the harshest supply failures in island and jungle fighting. Rice, dried food, fish, local gathering, captured goods and emergency stores could all matter, but sea distance, Allied control of shipping routes, disease, jungle terrain and isolation could turn a shortage into a daily issue. A small handful of rice might have to stand for order, ration and hope all at once. There was not much room for waste. What makes this wider view important is that every simple food item carries a whole system behind it, and every system could fail in its own way. The tin points to factories and trucks, the bread points to fields, ovens, wagons and requisition. The porridge points to kitchens struggling through cold and distance, the tea points to habit and supply across long routes, while the rice points to islands where the sea itself could close around a unit. This does not make the story less human, it makes it more exact. One soldier might complain about eating the same ration again, while another would have envied that complaint. One might be tired of cold tins, while another had reached the point of boiling bones, scraping mould, or measuring rice by the finger. By looking at them separately, the hunger becomes clearer. The American tin, the German bread, the Soviet porridge, the British tea, and the Japanese rice were not symbols placed neatly on a table. They were held by tired men in different weather, under different officers with different roads behind them, and different chances of seeing another meal. Their stomachs belonged to the same war, but not to the same story. So the answer has to be careful. World War II soldiers ate what their army could produce, what their front could receive, what the weather had not ruined, what the enemy had not cut off, and what luck had left within reach. Sometimes that meant a ration tin, sometimes it meant rice, roots, horse meat, soup, bread, tea, spoiled food, or nothing that deserved to be called a meal. The different ration cards showed that World War II hunger was not one simple story, but many shortages shaped by the army. Front, weather, distance, and time. Still, across all those differences, one truth remained the same when supply lines failed. Because a meal stopped being a pause from war and became proof that the men had not been completely abandoned. Soon, a single hot bowl from a field kitchen could make exhausted soldiers stand in silence, afraid that even speaking too loudly might make the warmth disappear. After many days of cold tins, hard biscuits, dirty water, and meals swallowed without comfort, the steam above the field kitchen looked almost unreal. The pot was not grand, and the soup inside it was probably thin, but it rose in white breath through the cold air while the men stood around with their tin bowls held close. Nobody spoke loudly. It was as if too much noise might make the meal disappear. A hot meal did more than fill a stomach. It told the soldier that the unit still had a kitchen, that someone had counted men, gathered fuel, found ingredients, lit a fire, and brought order back for at least 1 hour. After days of eating from pockets and tins, that mattered. The army felt present again. The food itself might have been simple: soup, porridge, stew, tea, coffee, boiled potatoes, bread softened by steam, or meat stretched through water and salt. Men did not need it to be perfect, they needed it to be warm, issued properly, and placed into their hands by a system that had not forgotten them. There was a quiet mercy in seeing steam rise from a bowl after so many meals that tasted like metal, grease, and dust. A man could wrap both hands around the tin and feel heat enter his fingers before the first mouthful reached him. He might drink too quickly at first, then slow down, because the warmth itself felt worth keeping. For a few minutes, the war became smaller than the bowl. Field kitchens, cookhouses, and ration distribution did not only serve the body. They helped hold morale together. A unit that received hot food could feel less abandoned, less scattered, and less reduced to animals searching for scraps. The men still had orders, danger, mud, and fatigue ahead of them, but the hot meal gave them proof that some part of the rear still reached forward. That proof could change behaviour. Men became less sharp with one another. They complained less for a little while. They slept more easily if the night allowed it, and they woke with slightly more patience. A hot meal did not erase hunger from the past days, but it could slow the breaking inside the group. This was not sentimental. It was practical. A soldier who had eaten something warm could think more clearly than one chewing a cold biscuit on a dry throat. His hands steadied, his temper softened, his body had a little more heat to spend through the night. Even if the calories were not enough, the feeling of being fed mattered in a way no chart could fully measure. In a modern kitchen, a hot bowl is ordinary enough to be ignored, but near the front, it could feel like proof that a man had not been reduced entirely to marching, digging, and obeying. That was why men gathered around the field kitchen with a kind of quiet respect. They watched the ladle. They watched the steam. They watched the pot as if it were telling them whether the day had turned slightly kinder. The cook also changed in that moment. Earlier, he may have been the man, handing out too little, scraping empty tins, or stretching water through scraps. Now he could give something that looked like help. He might still be tired, dirty, and short of ingredients, but the act of filling bowls gave him back some usefulness. Feeding men properly, even briefly, restored more than bodies. The line moved slowly. Each man stepped forward, received his portion, and moved aside to make room for the next. Some held the bowl close to their faces to let the steam reach cracked lips. Some closed their eyes after the first swallow. Others said nothing, because relief can make speech feel unnecessary. The strongest feeling in that line was not joy, but the sudden memory that food was supposed to comfort the living, not merely keep them from falling. That memory could hurt a little. It reminded men of kitchens, families, canteens, mess halls, farms, factories, railway stations, and ordinary evenings where a warm meal did not need to be earned by surviving shellfire. The bowl carried all of that for a moment. After eating, the unit might not be transformed, but it was less brittle. Men cleaned their bowls more carefully, saved a crust if they had one, and checked the pot without looking greedy. A few might joke again, softly. Someone might stretch out and actually sleep before the next order came. The danger outside remained. The enemy was not gone. The road behind them might still be damaged, the next delivery uncertain, and the field kitchen might fail again tomorrow. But for that evening, the men had received something better than dry survival. They had received a sign that the unit still functioned. That is why hot food carried such weight in war. It was fuel, but also a message. It told the soldier that he belonged to a group, that the group still had a rear, and that the rear still knew he needed more than ammunition. A bowl of soup could say what a speech could not. By the time the pot emptied, the men were still tired. Their faces remained thin, their boots wet, their hands rough, and their future uncertain. But the silence around them had changed. It was no longer only the silence of men conserving strength. It was also the silence of men holding warmth while it lasted. The hot meal showed that food in war was never only about calories, because one steaming bowl could make exhausted soldiers feel remembered for the first time in days. From that bowl, the final truth becomes clearer. Broken supply lines did not just change what men ate, but changed how long they could fight, think, sleep, and remain human. The whole story will narrow to one empty ration tin, one dirty potato, one dry canteen, and the simple question of what a soldier would put into his mouth when the army behind him finally failed. A cold tin of meat, a dirty potato, a bowl of thin soup, an empty canteen, and a piece of bread traded for cigarettes could tell the story better than a map. They were small things, easy to overlook beside tanks, aircraft, generals, and famous battles. But for the soldier at the front, war often came down to these objects in the hand: the pocket, the bowl, or the mouth. Food was never far from survival. When supply lines collapsed, the question became simple. What could still be eaten? What could still be carried? What could still be boiled, traded, scraped, stolen, stretched, or swallowed before the body gave out? Strategy became personal. People often remember World War II through movement and firepower. They remember armoured columns, bombers, naval convoys, artillery barrages, and commanders moving pieces across maps. Those things mattered, but the soldier outside the map lived by truck roads, rail lines, fuel cans, flour sacks, water points, field kitchens, pack animals, and hands that could still carry a ration crate through mud. The stomach had its own front line. There is a plain truth in this, that no army can keep fighting for long if the men holding the rifles are too hungry to stand properly. A soldier could have courage, training, orders, and ammunition, but hunger worked underneath all of that. It slowed his legs, it shortened his temper, it made his hands less steady and his sleep less restful. It turned every decision into something heavier. The food changed from place to place. Some men ate cold rations from tins. Some chewed hard biscuits until their mouths went dry. Some dug roots from frozen fields, searched abandoned kitchens, boiled bones, traded watches for bread, or ate meat from animals that had once pulled their guns. Others stared at dirty water, mouldy packets, spoiled rice, or soup so thin it barely deserved the name. That variety matters. A soldier in jungle did not hunger the same way as a soldier in winter fields. A man in a surrounded pocket did not eat like a man near a working field kitchen. American, German, Soviet, British, Japanese, and other troops all depend on different supply systems, different roads, different climates, and different chances. But when those systems failed, the feeling in the body became familiar. The meal got smaller. At first, the failure could look almost harmless: less bread, weaker coffee, a ration saved for morning, a tin scraped more carefully than before. Then the shortage moved deeper into pockets, kitchens, villages, roads, bodies, and minds. Men began to count what they had left instead of assuming another meal would come. A full plate at home can make food feel ordinary, but in a broken supply line, even one warm spoonful could feel like proof that the world had not completely turned away. That was why hot food mattered so much. It was not only calories, it was a message from the rear, from the unit, from the cook, from the system that still recognized the soldier as a man who needed more than bullets and commands. When that message failed, men improvised. They ate what could be found in fields and ruins. They took from empty houses, and sometimes from houses that were not empty enough. They traded cigarettes, knives, watches, and rings. They accepted food that made them ashamed, sick, or silent. Hunger did not always make men cruel. but it put cruelty within reach. Civilians often paid part of the price. Their flour, potatoes, animals, bread, and stored food could be taken by soldiers whose own supply had broken. Sometimes it was ordered, sometimes paid for, sometimes forced, and sometimes stolen. To the army, it might be a small requisition. To a family, it could be tomorrow's meal, leaving the kitchen. The wounded were paid differently. They needed food to recover, but they were often least able to reach it. They could not search fields, bargain at walls, carry tins, or stand in line without help. In a field station with too little water and thin soup, mercy itself became limited by what could be poured into a bowl. Care could not create bread from air. The hardest lesson is that hunger in war not only empties the stomach, but it also changes the meaning of fairness, shame, courage, and ordinary human decency. A man who saved a biscuit could look selfish or wise. A man who took food from a kitchen could feel both alive and guilty. A man who received a larger portion because he could still fight might eat beside someone weaker and feel the weight of every mouthful. Supply collapse also proved that victory on a map could be misleading. An army might advance faster than its own trucks. A retreating unit might leave food in mud because stopping meant dying. A warehouse full of enemy supplies could look like salvation, but still hide mines, spoilage, or the danger of men eating too much too quickly after days of hunger. Food was never simple once the system around it broke. By the end of such days, the soldier might sit beside a dying fire with a tin bowl in his hands. Around his boots lay empty ration cans, biscuit crumbs, mud, ash, and the small leftovers of choices no one wanted to make. The road behind him might be cut, the next delivery uncertain, and the night colder than the food in his stomach could answer. Still, he had to carry his weapon. That is where the subject becomes clearer. This is not a story meant to turn hunger into a spectacle. It is a way to see how war reaches the body through the smallest openings, through the throat, the belly, the hand holding a spoon, the cracked lip against a canteen, and the quiet shame of wanting one more bite when someone beside you has none. A soldier did not need a dramatic final moment to understand that supply was life. He understood it when the kitchen went cold, when the truck did not arrive, when the biscuit would not go down without water, when the pot held only skins and bones, and when a warm bowl made his eyes lower for reasons he did not want to explain. The body kept the record. The body always knew. So when we ask what World War II soldiers ate when supply lines collapsed, the answer is not one food. It is a whole chain of desperate substitutions. Cold tins instead of meals, roots instead of vegetables, dirty instead of a safe drink, trade instead of issue, horse meat instead of transport, thin soup instead of strength, and sometimes nothing but the hope that morning would bring a truck sound from the rear. They ate whatever kept them upright for one more day. This final part shows that broken supply lines not only decided what soldiers ate, but also how long they could think clearly, keep moving, trust one another, and remain human under pressure. The story ends with a soldier beside a fading fire, his bowl nearly empty, his canteen light, and his rifle still close enough to reach in the dark. So rest now, let the road grow quiet, and good night.